Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when France, a country that considers a poorly made croissant a declaration of war, got into an 8-year-long, soul-crushingly messy breakup with its North African territory, Algeria. Think of it as the world's most toxic family drama, but with tanks, geopolitical maneuvering, and a staggering amount of mutual denial. This is the story of how Algeria decided to cancel its forever war subscription with France, and the absolute chaos that followed. Yes, we're boiling down decades of brutal colonial policy and a bloody war for independence into a petty squabble between two personified nations. It's probably disrespectful, but it's way more fun. Before the inevitable betrayal and backstabbing begins, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. All right, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. To understand this whole mess, you first need to get one thing straight. In the mid-20th century, France didn't just own Algeria. It wasn't just another colony on the map like Morocco next door or some far-flung island. Oh no. In France's mind, Algeria was France, like legally, officially, on paper. It had carved the coastal region into 3 whole departments, the same administrative units you'd find in mainland France. For Paris, Algiers was as French as Lyon or Marseille, just with more sunshine and a significantly larger population that France preferred to ignore. This was the crown jewel, the masterpiece of its colonial empire, the living proof of its mission civilisatrice, its civilizing mission. France looked at Algeria like a proud parent showing off a prodigy child at a dinner party. Look at what we've built. It would preen, pointing to the grand boulevards in Algiers that looked suspiciously like the ones in Paris. We brought them culture and wine and bureaucracy. They should be thanking us. This happy family portrait, however, was a complete and utter fantasy. The reality on the ground was less a happy family and more a deeply dysfunctional household with a golden child and a forgotten one locked in the basement. On one side, you had about 1 million European settlers. These were the Pieds Noirs, literally Blackfeet, a term whose origin is still debated, but basically meant the Europeans over here. They were a mix of French, Spanish, Italian, and Maltese people, whose families had been in Algeria for generations. They ran the businesses, owned the best farmland, held all the political power, and enjoyed all the rights and privileges of full-blown French citizens. They were the ones France was talking to when it gushed about its beloved Algeria. On the other side, you had everyone else. About 9 million Muslim Algerians who were, technically, French subjects. This is a fantastic bit of political doublespeak that essentially means you have all the obligations of being French, like, say, dying for France in its world wars, but none of the benefits, like voting or having a say in how your own land is run. They were systematically disenfranchised, economically marginalized, and constantly reminded of their second-class status. Sure, France had an open offer. Any Muslim Algerian could apply to become a full citizen. They just had to renounce their status under Islamic law and accept the French civil code. For the vast majority of Algerians, this was like being told you could join an exclusive country club, but you had to publicly disown your entire family and heritage first. It was a non-starter, and France knew it. So, for decades, this pot of resentment was just simmering. The native Algerian population would politely ask for reforms. Maybe a little more representation, better jobs, maybe stop letting the settlers rig every single election. And every single time, France would nod thoughtfully in Paris, promise to look into it, and then the Pieds Noirs on the ground would throw a fit and block any meaningful change. This cycle of hope and betrayal had been going on for ages, but things got really spicy after World War II. Algerian soldiers had fought and died to liberate France from the Nazis, and they came home thinking, okay, surely now we get a little respect, a little equality. They were wrong. On May 8, 1945, the very day Europe was celebrating victory, a pro-independence demonstration in the Algerian town of Sétif turned violent. The French army and local settler militias responded with what can only be described as a complete and total rampage, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Algerian civilians. That event, the Sétif massacre, was the point of no return. It was the moment an entire generation of Algerians realized that asking nicely wasn't going to work. The polite requests were over. A new, more radical generation was coming of age, and they had just watched France get thoroughly humiliated and kicked out of Indochina at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. France looked vulnerable. It looked tired. And for these young Algerian nationalists, it looked like the perfect time to light a match. This dynamic can best be understood through a simple, imaginary conversation. Personified dialogue France. Strolling down a boulevard in Algiers, adjusting its beret. Ah, ma belle Algérie. Look at you, my darling. So wonderfully. Us. The architecture, the cafes, the delightful sense of ownership. You are my greatest success. Aren't you just thrilled to be a part of La Grande France? Algeria. Muttering from the shadows of a Casbah alley. You mean the part that isn't allowed in the good cafes? France. What was that, mon chéri? Don't mumble, it's unbecoming. You should be beaming with pride. We built you roads and ports. We took all your best land to grow vineyards for wine you're not supposed to drink. It's called civilization. It's a gift. Algeria. You rigged our local elections last year. My guy won and your governor just erased the results. France. Potato. Governance is complicated. The important thing is that we are one big, happy, indivisible family. Now stand over there by that palm tree. I want to take a picture for a postcard to show everyone how wonderful and tranquil it is here. This is the kind of breathtaking, galaxy-brained denial that usually precedes a disaster. France was so high on its own supply of imperial glory that it genuinely couldn't see the revolution staring it right in the face. It had constructed this perfect narrative of Algérie Française, a timeless and eternal bond, and refused to acknowledge the giant cracks forming in the foundation. It was a relationship built on a fundamental misunderstanding. France thought it was a loving parent, while Algeria felt like a prisoner planning a jailbreak. And that jailbreak was coming. A small group of determined Algerian nationalists had been meeting in secret, forming a new organization, the National Liberation Front, or FLN. And they weren't planning to ask for reforms anymore. They were planning to start a war. So while France was busy taking idyllic postcard photos and telling itself everything was fine, this new group, the FLN, was in the final stages of planning one of history's most audacious surprise parties. This wasn't going to be a polite political debate. This was going to be a full-blown, territory-wide, we're breaking up with you and also we've set your stuff on fire kind of statement. The FLN at this point was tiny. We're talking maybe a few hundred armed militants with old mismatched rifles and a whole lot of revolutionary zeal. They knew they couldn't possibly defeat the French army, one of the most powerful military forces on the planet at the time. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was psychological. They needed to shatter the illusion of a peaceful, happy Algérie Française. They had to prove in one spectacular night that a war of national liberation had begun. They needed to grab France, the Pieds Noirs, the Algerian people, and the entire world by the shoulders and shake them until their teeth rattled. Their plan was as simple as it was brilliant. Hit everything, everywhere, all at once. They chose the date with a poet's sense of irony. November 1st, 1954. In France, this is La Toussaint, All Saints' Day. It's a solemn national holiday, a day for visiting family graves, a quiet day of remembrance. By choosing this day, the FLN was guaranteeing maximum shock value. It was a symbolic desecration of the French calendar, a message that nothing was sacred anymore. This day would forever be known in Algerian history as Toussaint Rouge, Red All Saints' Day. As darkness fell on October 31st, small groups of FLN militants fanned out across the country, from the bustling cities on the coast to the remote villages in the Aurès Mountains. Then, in the early hours of November 1st, they struck. It was a wave of over 70 coordinated attacks. This wasn't a conventional invasion. It was death by 1,000 cuts. They threw homemade bombs at police stations, ambushed military patrols, sabotaged power plants, and cut telephone lines. In the countryside, they set fire to colonial farms and depots. The targets were carefully chosen symbols of the French colonial state. The violence was chaotic, widespread, and most importantly, completely unexpected. The immediate body count wasn't staggering. A handful of soldiers and policemen, a couple of pro-French local officials, and tragically, a young French schoolteacher and his wife, whose bus was ambushed. But again, the numbers weren't the point. The point was the message. Simultaneously, the FLN's political wing was busy too. A proclamation was broadcast from a secret radio station in Cairo, officially announcing the birth of the National Liberation Front and its one, non-negotiable goal, the restoration of a sovereign, democratic, and social Algerian state. They called on their fellow Algerians to join the fight, and in a gesture that would soon be forgotten in the escalating brutality, told the European settlers that they weren't the enemy. The colonial system was. Back in Paris, the news trickled in, painting a picture of utter confusion. France woke up on its quiet holiday to reports of chaos, explosions, ambushes. A full-blown insurrection where just yesterday there had been a picturesque vacation spot. The French government, a fragile coalition of squabbling parties known as the Fourth Republic, was completely blindsided. Their first reaction was not concern or introspection. It was pure, unadulterated, indignant rage. How dare they? The man in the hot seat was the Minister of the Interior, a young, ambitious politician named François Mitterrand. Yes, the very same Mitterrand who would later become a socialist icon and president of France. But back then, he was all about law and order. He went on the radio with a statement that would define France's disastrous approach for years to come. He declared that Algerian separatism was unthinkable and that the only possible response was force. He delivered the killer line, "La seule négociation, c'est la guerre." The only negotiation is war. Personified dialogue. France, in a silk dressing gown, spitting its morning espresso across the Élysée Palace. Sacre bleu. What do you mean there were incidents in Algeria? I just told the United Nations last week that Algeria was a beacon of tranquility and French benevolence. François Mitterrand, standing stiffly, holding a telex report. My apologies, sir. It appears a previously unknown group calling themselves the National Liberation Front launched about 70 loud expressions of discontent. Simultaneously, they blew up some things, shot at some people, and left a rather dramatic leaflet. France, the FLN. Who are these people? Bandits, criminals, a few malcontents hiding in the mountains. This is an internal police matter. Algeria is French. Its destiny is French. You cannot separate it from the metropole. Do you hear me? It is as French as Brittany or Burgundy. Mitterrand. Perfectly, sir. So no looking into their grievances, no discussion of political reform. France. Negotiate with terrorists. Don't be absurd. Send in the army. Arrest everyone. Double the police. Triple the patrols. We will crush this pathetic little rebellion in a matter of weeks. Algeria is France, and that is final. The only negotiation is war. Mitterrand, nodding grimly. Right. The only negotiation is war. I'll go tell the press. I am absolutely certain that declaring war on our own citizens will have no unforeseen negative consequences whatsoever. And this, right here, is the moment France tripped at the starting line and fell flat on its face. Instead of pausing for even a second to ask, wait, why would dozens of coordinated attacks suddenly erupt across a territory we thought was peaceful? They chose the path of stubborn, belligerent denial. They classified a nationalist uprising, a political movement born from a century of oppression, as a simple crime spree. It is like discovering a massive termite infestation in your house and concluding the solution is to just shout at the termites very loudly until they agree to leave. By refusing to acknowledge the FLN as a political entity with actual political goals, France locked itself into a purely military solution. They thought they could stamp out the rebellion quickly and quietly. What they actually did was pour gasoline on a flickering flame, guaranteeing that the few incidents of Toussaint Rouge would escalate into a full-blown, nation-defining, 8-year inferno. The FLN wanted a war to prove they were a nation. France, in its fury, was about to give them exactly what they wanted: So France has made its big declaration. The only negotiation is war. It promptly sends in the cavalry, or in this case, tens of thousands of paratroopers and French foreign legionnaires, who were all still vaguely annoyed about getting their butts handed to them in Indochina, and were looking for a win. The official French strategy was simple. This is a police action. They would pacify the countryside, conduct ratissage, a lovely term that means raking or combing through, and round up all the bandits responsible for the Toussaint Rouge attacks. The problem with raking an entire country is that you tend to rake up a lot of innocent people too. The French army, operating under a state of emergency, descended upon Algerian villages with a collective bad mood and a mandate to get results. This meant mass arrests, brutal interrogations, and a general atmosphere of, "You are all suspects until proven innocent," and we're not super interested in proof. This heavy-handed approach was, to put it mildly, a fantastic recruitment tool for the FLN. Every time a French patrol kicked down the wrong door or hauled an innocent farmer off to a detention camp, 5 more villagers would slip away into the mountains to join the rebellion. But the FLN was still in a tight spot. By mid-1955, they were getting hammered. The French military was very good at hunting down and killing guerrillas in the countryside. The FLN was losing fighters faster than it could replace them. Their leadership realized that if things continued this way, they'd be wiped out. They needed to change the game. They needed to escalate. They needed to make the situation so toxic, so irrevocably bloody, that the quiet majority of the Algerian population, the ones who were just trying to keep their heads down and hope the whole thing blew over, would be forced to choose a side. The architect of this new, terrifying strategy was a regional FLN commander named Zighud Youssef. His logic was as brutal as it was effective. He understood that the FLN's greatest enemy wasn't just the French army. It was the middle ground. It was the idea that some kind of peaceful, reformed coexistence was still possible. To win, he had to destroy that idea completely. And how do you do that? You provoke your enemy into an act of such massive, indiscriminate violence that it proves to everyone that there is no safety in neutrality. You have to engineer a massacre. On August 20th, 1955, Zighud put his plan into action. FLN militants, alongside a mob of local Muslim villagers they'd armed with whatever was available, shotguns, knives, farm tools, marched on the mining town of Philippeville and its surrounding European settlements. What followed was an act of premeditated horror. They attacked the Pied Noir civilian population, slaughtering men, women, and children in their homes and on the streets. Over 120 people were killed in the most gruesome ways imaginable. It was a savage, unforgivable act of terror, and it was exactly what Zighud wanted, because he knew, with absolute certainty, how France would react. France didn't just take the bait. It swallowed the hook, the line, the sinker, the fishing rod, and the fisherman. The French army and local Pied Noir vigilante groups, blind with rage and grief, went on a murderous rampage. For days, they conducted a reprisal that was less a military operation and more a pogrom. They executed thousands of Muslim civilians. Entire villages were razed. People were rounded up in the local stadium and machine-gunned. The official French report listed about 1,200 Algerian dead. A moderate Algerian, rushing to an FLN commander, his face pale with horror. "My God, what have you done? You attacked civilians. You butchered families in Philippeville. This is a monstrosity." Fauchelin, calmly cleaning a rifle, not looking up. "Yes, it was. Moderate Algerian. But why? This will bring the full wrath of the French army down upon all of us. They will show no mercy." FLN finally looks up, his eyes cold. "Exactly. Before today, you and men like you spoke of dialogue and reform. You believed you could reason with France. You thought if you were a good Muslim and the French would protect you. Now look out your window. Do you see the paratroopers dragging your neighbor from his home? Do you see the smoke rising from the next village? They aren't asking who was with us on August 20th. They are only asking who is a Muslim. The ditch they are digging is for all of us. The bridge to a peaceful middle ground is on fire, my friend. We just forced you to decide which side of the river you want to die on. Zighud Youchef's ghastly gamble had paid off spectacularly. In the weeks following the Philippeville massacre and the French reprisals, thousands of previously neutral Algerians, their hope for a peaceful solution incinerated, flocked to join the FLN. The rebellion swelled from a few scattered guerrilla bands into a genuine popular army. The FLN had successfully created a chasm of hatred between the two communities, a chasm so deep it could never be bridged. They had proven that France would not, and could not, protect the average Algerian. Their only hope for survival, the FLN argued, was to fight, and France, in its predictable, unrestrained fury, had just co-signed that argument in blood. This single event transformed a containable insurgency into a full-blown war for national independence. The situation was no longer a police matter. It was a five-alarm political and military catastrophe, and France was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, declaring that the only negotiation was war wasn't the masterstroke of policy they thought it was. They needed a new plan. After the bloodbath at Philippeville and the even bloodier reprisals, a cold, clammy sense of panic started to creep into the halls of government in Paris. The swift police action was now a year old and had morphed into a full-scale, incredibly brutal war. The sledgehammer approach had not only failed to crush the rebellion, it had supercharged it. France, realizing its initial strategy had the finesse of a rhinoceros performing ballet, decided it needed a new plan. It needed a brain. So, it rummaged through its political establishment and pulled out Jacques Soustelle. Soustelle was not your typical colonial governor. He was a brilliant academic, a world-renowned anthropologist, a young, energetic intellectual who was also a decorated member of the French resistance. On paper, he was the perfect guy for the job. He was a liberal, a progressive, a man who could supposedly see the bigger picture. The government in Paris basically shoved him onto a plane and said, "Jacques, the Algeria situation is a bit sticky. Go down there and use your big brain to unstick it. And for God's sake, try not to set anything else on fire." When Soustelle arrived in Algiers in early 1955, the Pieds Noirs greeted him with a shower of rotten tomatoes and insults. They saw his liberal reputation and immediately assumed he was there to negotiate with the terrorists and sell them out. They couldn't have been more wrong. Soustelle took one look at the situation and had a genuine eureka moment. He diagnosed the problem correctly. The rebellion was fueled by the systemic inequality, the political disenfranchisement, and the economic misery of the Muslim population. The two-tiered system of citizens and subjects was the disease. And he had the cure, l'intégration. This wasn't some flimsy promise. Soustelle proposed a real, radical, honest-to-God integration of the Muslim population into the French Republic. His plan was to systematically demolish the entire colonial apparatus. He wanted to give all Algerians full French citizenship, with the right to vote, without forcing them to abandon their Muslim identity. He planned to pour massive government investment into building schools, hospitals, and factories to create jobs and opportunities. He wanted to recruit Algerians into the civil service, promote Arabic in schools, and basically do everything possible to make the phrase Algerie Française a reality of equality, not a slogan for supremacy. It was, in essence, the very deal that moderate Algerian nationalists had been begging France for the last 50 years. And that was the problem. It was 50 years too late. Showing up with the perfect solution decades after the problem has metastasized into something far worse is a special kind of tragic irony. The FLN, having now crossed the river of blood at Philippeville, had absolutely zero interest in becoming better treated French citizens. The goalposts hadn't just moved. They were in a different country now. The demand was no longer for equality, it was for sovereignty. Personified dialogue France, pacing nervously in its Paris office. "All right, Jacques, my boy. You're our star player. The intellectuals love you. What is it you do? An ethnologist? Sounds clever. Look, Algeria is having a major tantrum, and the army's method of dealing with it involves just breaking all the furniture. We need a softer touch. Go down there and, fix it." Jacques Soustelle, eyes gleaming with intellectual confidence. But of course, I have already formulated the perfect strategy. It's called integration. We won't just crush them, we will embrace them. We will make them so truly, genuinely, wonderfully French they'll forget they ever wanted to rebel. Full citizenship, economic parity. We shall hug them into submission with progressive social policies. France, hug them? Jacques, they are currently planting bombs. Are you quite sure that's the correct tactical response? Soutel, positive. Their violence is merely a cry for inclusion, a sociological symptom of their marginalization. Once they see that we genuinely want them to be an equal part of our glorious family, they will lay down their arms and we shall all sing La Marseillaise in perfect bilingual harmony. It's simple social science. France shrugs. Fine, whatever, give the hugging a try. But if it doesn't work, maybe do your hugging from behind a line of paratroopers, just in case. Soutel, bless his well-intentioned academic heart, went to work. He set up specialized administrative teams, the SAS, staffed by Arabic-speaking French officers tasked with winning hearts and minds by building schools and clinics in remote villages. It was a noble effort, but Soutel was a man caught between two worlds. With one hand, he was offering economic development and social reform. With the other, he was the governor-general of a territory at war, and he was signing off on the army's increasingly brutal counterinsurgency tactics. And as the months wore on, something inside him began to change. He saw the FLN's continued violence, not just against the French, but against fellow Muslims they deemed traitors. He saw his grand, generous offer of integration thrown back in his face with bombs and assassinations. The liberal intellectual became disillusioned. The violence wasn't just a sociological symptom anymore. It was, in his eyes, pure, nihilistic terrorism. The man who had arrived as a progressive reformer slowly but surely transformed into a hardliner. He became convinced that the FLN had to be utterly destroyed before his vision of a truly integrated French Algeria could ever be realized. The settlers who had once thrown tomatoes at him now saw him as their greatest champion. Jacques Soutel, the hugger, had decided it was time to start punching. His tragedy was in crafting the perfect key for a lock that had already been changed. While France was busy with its bizarre good cop, bad cop routine, sending in an anthropologist to offer hugs while the army offered bullets, the Algerian rebellion was having a bit of an identity crisis of its own. Sure, the Philippeville strategy had been brutally effective at recruitment, and their numbers were swelling. But they were still a messy, decentralized patchwork of guerrilla groups. You had the fighters on the ground in Algeria, the internals, who were doing all the bleeding and dying, and you had the political leaders living in exile in Cairo and Tunis, the externals, who were busy giving press conferences and trying to win diplomatic support. The guys on the inside felt the guys on the outside were out-of-touch political hacks, and the guys on the outside thought the guys on the inside were just dumb grunts who needed their political guidance. It was a classic case of the field office hating the corporate headquarters. The FLN knew that if they wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, if they wanted to become a government in waiting instead of just a well-armed protest group, they needed to get their act together. They needed a unified command structure, a coherent political platform, and a clear vision for the future. So, in one of the most audacious moves of the entire war, they decided to hold a board meeting, a top-secret, high-level strategic planning conference. And they decided to hold it not in the safety of a neighboring country, but right under the nose of the 500,000 French soldiers actively trying to hunt them down, deep inside Algeria itself. In August 1956, the most wanted men in the country secretly made their way to a secluded, wooded valley in the Soumam region of Kabylia. For 20 days, while French patrols crisscrossed the surrounding mountains, the FLN leadership hammered out the future of the revolution. This wasn't just a campfire chat. It was the founding congress of a nation at war. The two masterminds of the event were Abane Ramdane and Larbi Ben Mahidi, two of the internals who were tired of the chaos and determined to impose some order, and impose order they did. The document that came out of this conference, the Soumam Platform, was their Declaration of Independence and their constitution rolled into one. It made two monumentally important decisions that would shape the rest of the war. First, they declared the primacy of the interior over the exterior. This was a massive power play. It meant that the leaders fighting inside Algeria would have the final say on policy, not the blowhards giving speeches from their hotel rooms in Cairo. It was the field office telling corporate HQ to shut up and listen. Second, and even more importantly, they established the primacy of the political over the military. This was genius. They formally stated that the FLN's military wing was just a tool in service of a political goal. The politicians, not the generals, would call the shots. This single decision prevented the Algerian Revolution from devolving into a bunch of competing warlords and ensured that they remained a focused, political movement with a clear objective: a sovereign state. They also created the structures of that future state: a 34-member National Council of the Algerian Revolution, CNRA, to act as a parliament, and a 5-member Committee of Coordination and Execution, CCE, to act as the executive cabinet. They had, in secret, built a government. Personified dialogue. French General Number 1, staring at an intelligence brief, spilling his pastis. You are telling me they had a what? They held a 3-week-long corporate team-building seminar in the middle of the bled, and we missed it? French General Number 2, intelligence confirms it, sir. The entire FLN leadership. Apparently, they had breakout sessions on the future of the nation and effective governance in a time of war. They even drafted a mission statement. General Number 1, a mission statement? Our mission statement is try not to let the politicians in Paris screw this up worse than they already have. How is it possible that the most wanted terrorists in the country can hold a secret convention a few miles from our patrols? We have 400,000 men here. General Number 2, to be fair, sir, we were very busy implementing Governor Soustel's aggressive hugging initiative in that sector last month. And besides, we assumed they were just disorganized bandits. General Number 1, disorganized bandits don't create bicameral legislative bodies. Disorganized bandits don't issue formal communiques about the primacy of the political over the military. My God, they have a more coherent political structure than we do. Our government collapses every 6 months. This was a moment of profound, galaxy-level embarrassment for France. While they were still debating the fundamental nature of the conflict, the FLN was busy drafting bylaws and electing committee chairs. The Sumam conference was the moment the rebellion put on a suit and tie. They had successfully transformed themselves from a collection of angry guerrilla fighters into a structured, disciplined, and politically sophisticated national liberation movement. They now had a chain of command, a political program, and a government, all operating in the shadows. France was still playing checkers, convinced it was dealing with a minor insurrection it could eventually crush. It failed to notice that the FLN had just set up a chessboard and was already thinking 5 moves ahead. And their next move was going to be a big one, to take the war out of the mountains and into the heart of the capital itself. Fresh off their secret woodland conference, the newly organized and highly motivated FLN decided it was time for a major brand relaunch. Fighting a guerrilla war in the remote mountains was fine, but it wasn't getting them the international headlines they desperately needed. To the rest of the world, the Algerian war was just a messy internal French affair, a colonial spat happening somewhere dusty and far away. The FLN needed to change the channel. They needed to take the war from the countryside and plant it squarely on France's front porch. And in Algeria, the biggest, fanciest, most French front porch there was the capital city of Algiers. The plan, masterminded by the FLN's urban warfare guru, Saadi Yachef, was as simple as it was brutal: turn Algiers into a living hell for the French. The goal wasn't to militarily conquer the city. That was impossible. The goal was to generate chaos. It was, in modern terms, terrorism as a public relations strategy. If they could prove that France couldn't even control the capital of its most prized department, then the French claim to sovereignty would look like a joke. And most importantly, the nightly news reports of bombs going off in a major Western city would force the United Nations to stop ignoring them and start talking about the Algerian question. Algiers at the time was a city of 2 worlds, practically designed for this kind of conflict. You had the European quarter, a sparkling modern city that looked like it had been airlifted from the French Riviera. It had wide boulevards, chic cafes, cinemas, and department stores. This was the heart of French power and Pied Noir life. And then clinging to the hillside above it, you had the Kasbah, the ancient walled Muslim city, a dense labyrinthine maze of steep, narrow alleys, twisting staircases and hidden courtyards. It was a city within a city, a place where a stranger could get lost in seconds and an entire guerrilla network could disappear without a trace. The Kasbah became the FLN's fortress, command center, and bomb factory. In the autumn of 1956, the newly formed CCE, the FLN's executive committee, unleashed their campaign. At first, it was targeted assassinations of police officers and suspected collaborators. But the strategy quickly escalated into indiscriminate attacks on civilians. The FLN's deadliest new weapon was its female operatives, the Fidayat, young women who could dress like modern Europeans, cut their hair, and ditch their traditional veils. They could slip past the French checkpoints, their handbags or shopping baskets carrying not groceries but timed explosives. On September 30th, 1956, the campaign exploded into the world's consciousness. In a coordinated triple attack, bombs went off at the Milk Bar, a popular student cafe, the cafeteria on the Rue de Lille, and the downtown Air France terminal. Suddenly, the war was no longer a distant rumble in the mountains. It was inside the city, in the places where Europeans felt safest. The bombings created a tidal wave of terror that swept through the Pied Noir community. Every cafe, every bus stop, every cinema was a potential target. Life in the European quarter ground to a halt, paralyzed by fear. The civil police were completely out of their depth. They couldn't get a single informant inside the impenetrable Kasbah, which was now ruled by the FLN. In response, extremist Pied Noir groups started their own counter-terror campaigns, planting their own bombs in the crowded alleys of the Kasbah. The city was descending into a sickeningly predictable tit-for-tat cycle of violence. The French civil authorities had lost control. Personified dialogue. The city of Algiers, a nervous, sophisticated character, dabbing sweat from its brow with a silk handkerchief. Okay, FLN darling, I see you've moved into the Kasbah. Welcome, I suppose. Now look, I have a certain reputation to uphold. The pearl of the Mediterranean, Paris on the sea. Let's try to keep the revolutionary business indiscreet, shall we? FLN, sharpening a knife in a shadowy alley. Oh, don't you worry your pretty little boulevards about it. We're not here for discretion. We're here for a complete rebranding. We're changing your title from chic vacation spot to ground zero of the global decolonization movement. Think of the press. Algiers. Rebranding? You're putting bombs in my milk bars. My European quarter is on the verge of a collective nervous breakdown, and my Kasbah has become a no-go zone run by you. This is a complete disaster for my tourism sector. FLN. It's a disaster for France's credibility, which is exactly the point. A war in the mountains is a back-page story. A bomb in a cafe is a headline. The UN is debating its new agenda as we speak. Now try to look tragically beautiful for the cameras. Your close-up is coming. This was the moment the war became unavoidable, a spectacle of urban terror broadcast to the world. The FLN's strategy, while monstrous, was working perfectly. They had turned the symbols of French colonial life, the carefree cafe culture, the bustling city streets, into sites of fear and death. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, designed to provoke and to publicize. France, whose civil government in Algiers was now effectively powerless, realized it had to do something drastic. The police couldn't handle it. The politicians couldn't handle it. When a situation is that hopelessly out of control, you do what the French Fourth Republic always did when it was backed into a corner. You call in the army. And not just any army unit. You call in the toughest, most ruthless guys you have, the paratroopers. So Algiers is officially a 5-alarm fire. The civil government has melted into a puddle of panic. The police are hiding under their desks, and the city is eating itself alive in a cycle of terror and counter-terror. France, in a moment of sheer desperation, decides to stop sending in administrators with bright ideas, and instead sends in the guys whose only idea is the application of overwhelming force. In January 1957, the French government officially handed over full police powers for the city of Algiers to the military, specifically to General Jacques Massu and his elite 10th Parachute Division. The Paras were coming to town. General Massu was not a man who believed in hugs. He was a hardened, no-nonsense veteran of World War II and Indochina, and he looked at the chaos in Algiers not as a complex political problem, but as a giant cancerous tumor that needed to be surgically and violently removed. The politicians in Paris basically told him, "Fix it. We don't care how. Just make the bombs stop." This was the equivalent of giving a surgeon a blank check and a chainsaw. Massu and his colonels, particularly the infamous Marcel Bigard, were brutally effective strategists. They understood they weren't fighting an army they could meet on a battlefield. The FLN in Algiers was a clandestine network, a terrorist octopus as they called it. You couldn't kill it by just cutting off a tentacle. It would just grow back. You had to kill the brain. Their intelligence officers quickly figured out the FLN's structure. It was a pyramid, a network of small 5-person cells. Each member of a cell only knew the other 4 members and the one leader directly above them. The only way to unravel the entire organization was to grab one person from the bottom, make them talk, identify their superior, grab that person, make them talk, and climb the ladder of names all the way to the top. It was a methodical, painstaking process of demolition. And this brings us to the making them talk part. This is the dark, ugly, and morally bankrupt heart of the Battle of Algiers. The Paras didn't have time for due process or clever detective work. Speed was everything. If they captured a suspect, they had to get the names of his co-conspirators within hours before the network realized he'd been taken and had time to scatter. So, the paratroopers became interrogators, and their method of interrogation was systematic, assembly line torture. They used euphemisms, of course. They called it interrogatoire poussés, enhanced or pushed interrogations. But what it really was beatings, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and most notoriously, the GIGN, applying electric shocks from a hand-cranked field telephone generator. This wasn't random sadistic cruelty, though there was plenty of that too. It was a cold, calculated military tactic. And this is the most uncomfortable truth of the entire battle. It worked. Horrifyingly, sickeningly, it worked. For 9 months, the Paras laid siege to the Kasbah, not with tanks and artillery, but with arrests in the dead of night, with informants and with torture chambers set up in villas across the city. They ripped the FLN's network apart, piece by bloody piece. They followed the chain of command all the way to the top, eventually capturing the FLN's Algiers commander, Saadi Youssef, and capturing and killing another of the revolution's founders, Larbi Ben Mehidi, who was officially reported to have committed suicide in his cell, a claim nobody believed for a second. By the autumn of 1957, the bombs had stopped. The FLN organization in Algiers was annihilated. The Paras were triumphant. General Massu had won the Battle of Algiers. Personified dialogue France, wringing its hands, tie askew. "General, thank God you're here. Algiers is a nightmare. Bombs in the cinemas, bombs in the cafes. The police are useless, the city is screaming. You must restore order. Do whatever it takes." General Massu, calmly lighting a Gauloise, the smoke curling around his hardened face, understood. "Whatever it takes. You are officially ceding all police powers to my division? No civilian courts, no pesky lawyers, no oversight from Paris getting in my way?" France, "Yes, of course, whatever you need, just make it stop. We need peace, we need quiet." General Massu, "Very well, my men and I will sanitize the city. But let us be perfectly clear. We are not social workers. We are not policemen. We are soldiers. And this is a pest control operation. It will be efficient, and it will be exceptionally unpleasant. When we are finished, Algiers will be the quietest city in North Africa. But do not ask me to show you my methods. And when the Bleeding Heart newspapers and the United Nations start screaming, do not pretend to be surprised." And this was the moment France won the battle, but began to irrevocably lose the war. In the process of saving Algiers, the Paras exposed the rotten moral core of the French mission. To defeat an enemy that used terror, France became a state that used terror. To fight a movement that operated outside the law, France suspended the law. They destroyed the FLN's network, but they also destroyed their own claim to be the purveyors of civilization, justice, and liberty. The victory was a military masterpiece and a moral catastrophe. The bombs were silenced, but the screams from the torture chambers would echo for decades, creating a chasm of hatred that no military victory could ever hope to bridge. The battle was won, but the news of how it was won was about to leak out, and the international community was taking notes. General Massu and his paras had won the Battle of Algiers. The city was quiet. The FLN network was a smoking ruin. By all military metrics, it was a stunning victory. But the problem with winning a battle using methods that would make a dictator blush is that the story tends to get out. And the story that started trickling, then flooding out of Algiers was not one of heroic French soldiers saving a city. It was a story of midnight arrests, of institutionalized torture, of summary executions, and of thousands of disappeared Algerians who had been swallowed by the military's dragnet never to be seen again. France tried its absolute best to keep a lid on it. They censored newspapers, seized articles, and officially denied everything. The official line was that the FLN's claims were vile propaganda and that the army had behaved with exemplary discipline. But you can't silence everyone. Some soldiers, horrified by what they had been ordered to do, wrote letters home. Some brave French journalists and intellectuals, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, began publishing harrowing accounts of what was really happening. Torture survivors who managed to get out told their stories. The French government's wall of denial began to crack. This was a massive, game-changing gift to the FLN's external leadership. Their entire strategy of taking the war to Algiers was designed to attract the world's attention, and now, thanks to the paratroopers' brutal efficiency, they had it. The FLN's diplomats, operating out of Tunis and Cairo, now had all the ammunition they needed. They went to the United Nations not with abstract arguments about self-determination, but with concrete, stomach-churning evidence of French war crimes. The Algerian question was now the hottest, most explosive topic on the international agenda. At the UN headquarters in New York, France adopted a posture of supreme, almost comical arrogance. Its official position was that Algeria was an internal matter. L'Algérie, c'est la France, their diplomats repeated like a mantra. Algeria is France. Therefore, what happened in Algiers was a domestic police action, and it was absolutely none of the UN's business. This was the diplomatic equivalent of a man setting his own house on fire and then yelling at the fire department for trespassing. The whole situation was made infinitely more awkward by the Cold War. The Soviet Union, of course, had a field day. They loudly championed the FLN's cause, not because they cared deeply about Algerian independence, but because it was a golden opportunity to bash a major NATO power and score points with the developing world. The United States, meanwhile, was trapped in a vortex of hypocrisy. On one hand, France was a crucial ally against the Soviets in Europe. On the other hand, America was desperately trying to convince newly independent nations in Asia and Africa to join its team, and siding with an old-school, brutal colonial power was, to put it mildly, off-brand. So the US would publicly mumble its support for France, while privately its diplomats were grabbing their French counterparts by the lapels and hissing, "Are you insane? Settle this. You're making capitalism look bad." A charismatic young senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy even gave a fiery speech on the Senate floor, calling for Algerian independence and infuriating Paris. Personified dialogue, United Nations, knocking timidly on a grand ornate door labeled France. Ahem, excuse me, France. So sorry to bother you. It's just that several of the newer members from the Afro-Asian bloc have lodged a rather strongly worded complaint about the goings-on in Algiers. There are reports of screaming. France opens the door a crack, looking disheveled with a faint smell of smoke about it. This is a private domestic affair concerning internal security. It is of no concern to this assembly of busybodies. My house, my rules. United Nations, we understand. It's just, the reports mention things like systematic torture and extrajudicial killings. It's creating a bit of a public relations nightmare for the civilized world club. People are talking. USA, leaning in from behind the UN, whispering loudly, "Psst, France, dude, read the room. The whole colonizer cool thing is over. Just give them a parliament or something. You're losing the moral high ground, and we're the ones who have to fight the commies for it." France. The moral high ground is wherever I am standing. L'Algérie, c'est la France. Forever. Now if you'll excuse me, I have some domestic dissidents to suppress. Slams the door shut. The sound of a bolt sliding home echoing down the hall. France kept winning the votes at the UN, using its diplomatic weight as a permanent Security Council member to block any meaningful resolutions. But each debate was a defeat. Each headline about torture stripped away another layer of its international prestige. The FLN may have lost the battle on the streets of the Kasbah, but they were decisively winning the war for global public opinion. The military victory had turned into a political and moral catastrophe. The constant grinding pressure from the outside world, combined with the growing anti-war movement inside France itself, was creating an unbearable strain. France's government, a notoriously unstable coalition known as the Fourth Republic, was starting to groan under the weight of it all. The war wasn't just destroying Algeria anymore. It was about to break France itself. The military victory in Algiers might have silenced the bombs, but the political fallout was creating a deafening explosion back in Paris. The constant drip of stories about torture, the endless diplomatic humiliations at the UN, and the ever-growing casualty lists were poisoning the well of French politics. The war had become a political acid test that no government could pass. This was a huge problem because the government in question, the French Fourth Republic, was already about as stable as a unicycle on a tightrope during an earthquake. The Fourth Republic was a system specifically designed to be weak. After the whole Vichy collaboration with the Nazis' unpleasantness, France was terrified of another strongman leader. So they created a parliamentary system with a feeble executive branch. The result was a chaotic merry-go-round of coalition governments. Prime ministers came and went with bewildering speed. Some governments lasted only a few weeks before collapsing over some petty squabble. Now throw a brutal, expensive, and morally corrosive colonial war into that meat grinder of a political system. The result was total paralysis. Every party had a different, non-negotiable position on Algeria. The political left and the anti-war intellectuals wanted to negotiate with the FLN and find a political exit. To the right, the army and the Pieds Noirs, this was tantamount to treason. The right wanted an all-out military victory at any cost, a fantasy that was becoming more unpopular and financially ruinous by the day. Any prime minister who tried to appease one side was immediately brought down by the other. The French government was basically a car with two drivers, one trying to turn left and the other trying to turn right, while the car itself was hurtling towards a cliff. In May of 1958, the car finally went over the edge. The latest government collapsed, shocking I know, and the man nominated to become the next prime minister was a fellow named Pierre Flimlin. Flimlin had a reputation for being a moderate who was, and this is the crucial part, quietly in favor of opening negotiations with the FLN. When the news of his impending appointment reached Algiers, the French military and the Pieds Noirs had a collective, thermonuclear meltdown. This was it. This was the ultimate betrayal. The spineless politicians in Paris were about to sell them out and surrender Algeria. On May 13, 1958, a massive mob of enraged settlers stormed the Governor-General's headquarters in Algiers. But this wasn't just a riot. The French army, the very force that was supposed to maintain order, stood aside and let it happen. In fact, they joined in. General Massu, yes, the hero of the Battle of Algiers, stepped onto a balcony, addressed the cheering crowd, and announced the formation of a committee of public safety to run Algeria. It was, in everything but name, a military coup against the civilian government. From Algiers, the generals issued an ultimatum to Paris: drop Flimlin, scrap the government, and form a new one, a government of national salvation led by the one man they trusted, a man who was living in quiet retirement in his country home, a man named Charles de Gaulle. To prove they weren't bluffing, the generals in Algiers activated Operation Resurrection, a detailed plan to drop thousands of paratroopers on Paris to seize the capital. The French Republic was now staring down the barrel of a gun held by its own celebrated army. Personified dialogue. The Fourth Republic. A frail, sweaty man in an ill-fitting suit, shuffling papers nervously. Right, gentlemen, another Tuesday, another government to form. On the matter of Algeria, the left is demanding negotiations. The right is demanding total victory. Perhaps if we authorize more troops while simultaneously printing some pamphlets about peace. Does that work for everyone? The French army. Kicking the office door off its hinges, personified as a grim-faced general covered in the dust of Algiers. We are done listening to you. While you dither and debate, we bleed. You are losing this war for us with your political cowardice. The Fourth Republic. Now see here. This is a democracy. I am the legally constituted government. You can't just barge in here and... The French army. We've formed a committee in Algiers. It is now in charge of Algeria. And we have a simple, non-negotiable demand. You will resign. You will dissolve this pathetic excuse for a republic. And you will hand full emergency powers to General Charles de Gaulle. Or these paratroopers who are at this very moment boarding their planes are going to conduct a hostile takeover of the city of Paris. The choice is yours. The Fourth Republic. Voice trembling, dropping all its papers. But that's a coup. That's treason. The French army. We call it a suggestion for national renewal. You have 24 hours. And that was that. Faced with a full-blown military insurrection and the imminent threat of paratroopers landing on the Champs-Élysées, the politicians in Paris folded like a cheap suit. Flimlin resigned before he could even properly take office. The Fourth Republic, weak, discredited, and powerless, effectively voted itself out of existence. The Algerian War had become a political black hole so dense it had just consumed its own government. The system was broken. The politicians had failed. The army was an open rebellion. There was only one person left who everyone thought might be able to pull France back from the brink of civil war. The call went out to the village of Colombe-les-Deux-Églises. It was time to summon the legend. So France is on fire. The government has collapsed. The army is in open rebellion and there are paratroopers revving their plane engines, ready to turn Paris into a military parking lot. The country is staring into the abyss of a full-blown civil war. In moments of total systemic failure like this, nations don't turn to politicians, they turn to myths. And in 1958, France had only one myth left walking the earth. A 67-year-old, impossibly tall, deeply stubborn retired general named Charles de Gaulle. Let's be clear about who this guy was. Charles de Gaulle wasn't just another politician, he was a living monument. He was the man who, in 1940, when France had surrendered to the Nazis, got on a BBC radio microphone in London and became the lone voice of French resistance. He was the symbol of national honor, the literal embodiment of a France that refused to die. After the war, he had a brief, angry stint as head of the government, but he quit in 1946 in total disgust at the weak, party-dominated Fourth Republic they were creating. He basically said, "This system is garbage, and it will fail. Call me when it does," and retreated to his country home in the village of Colombe-les-Deux-Églises to write his memoirs and wait. He'd been waiting for 12 years. Now his phone was ringing. The panicked, soon-to-be-extinct politicians of the Fourth Republic came to him, cap in hand. They were desperate. He was their only hope. And de Gaulle, who had been playing this scenario out in his head for over a decade, knew he had them completely cornered. He wasn't going to be just another prime minister in their broken system. He was going to be the man who ended their system. He laid out his terms, and they were not a negotiation. They were an ultimatum. 1. He would be granted full and absolute emergency powers to rule by decree for 6 months. No more voting, no more parliamentary debates. His word would be law. 2. He would be given the authority to draft an entirely new constitution for France, one that would scrap their pathetic parliamentary system and replace it with a powerful, authoritative presidency. In short, he told the National Assembly, "I will return to power, but only if you first vote to make yourselves completely irrelevant and then give me a license to kill the republic you serve." The politicians were aghast. This was a demand for a legal, temporary dictatorship. It was the end of democracy as they knew it. But then they looked out the window and metaphorically saw the paratroopers parachuting onto the Eiffel Tower. Their choice was between democratic suicide and national suicide. With a gun to their heads, they chose to live. The National Assembly of the Fourth Republic held its nose and voted to give Charles de Gaulle everything he wanted. He became its final prime minister, with a clear mandate to take it out behind the woodshed and put it out of its misery. The genius of de Gaulle at this moment was that he was all things to all people. The army and the settlers in Algiers, the very people who had triggered the coup in his name, were delirious with joy. They had won. Their hero, the great nationalist, the man of 1940, had returned. For them, it was a certainty that de Gaulle would use his new power to crush the FLN and anchor Algeria to France forever. Meanwhile, in mainland France, the exhausted public and the terrified politicians saw him as the only figure with enough stature to stand up to the army, end the threat of a coup, and somehow, some way, find an honorable exit from the endless, bleeding wound of the war. Everybody saw the savior they wanted to see. And de Gaulle, a master of sphinx-like ambiguity, said nothing to discourage any of them. Personified dialogue. France, banging frantically on the gate of a country estate, clothes torn, hair a mess. General, General de Gaulle, for the love of God, open up. The Republic is on fire. The army is coming. The whole thing is falling apart. Charles de Gaulle. The gate creaks open to reveal de Gaulle, impeccably dressed, calmly inspecting a rosebush with pruning shears. He does not look up. Is that so? How chaotic. One finds that a lack of proper authority often leads to such unpleasantness. France. Please, General, you are the only one they respect, the only one who can stop them. You must come back and lead us. De Gaulle snips a single perfect rose and examines it. Lead you? You and your chattering little parties? Your pathetic, powerless republic? No. I will not lead you. I will replace you. I will return to Paris on 2 conditions. First, you will grant me absolute power for 6 months. Second, you will grant me the authority to write a new constitution, a proper one, with a head of state who can actually, head the state. France, absolute power, a new constitution, but that's the end of everything we stand for. De Gaulle finally looks at France with cold, unwavering eyes. No, it is the end of the fever. I am the cure. You may accept my terms or you may enjoy your civil war. Now, if you'll excuse me, this rose requires my full attention. And so, the legend returned. De Gaulle was summoned from his farm like the Roman general Cincinnatus, called upon to save the state in its darkest hour. The hardliners thought they had summoned a warrior king who would lead them to victory in Algeria. The moderates thought they had summoned a wise statesman who would lead them to peace. The truth was they had summoned Charles de Gaulle, and Charles de Gaulle had his own ideas. His first stop, a trip to Algiers, to face the very generals and the very crowds who thought they had put him in power. Charles de Gaulle, now armed with the power of a Roman dictator, makes his first move, and it's a bold one. He flies directly into the eye of the hurricane. On June 4th, 1958, his plane touches down in Algiers, the city whose military insurrection had just carried him to power. The atmosphere is electric. The entire European population seems to have poured into the streets, a roaring sea of 500,000 people waving French tricolor flags, chanting his name, absolutely delirious with triumph. They are not there to greet a politician. They are there to welcome a messiah. For them, the equation is simple. De Gaulle is the ultimate patriot. Therefore, de Gaulle will save French Algeria. The whole scene is a massive citywide victory party. De Gaulle, looking every inch the military legend in his general's uniform, makes his way to the Forum, the large square in front of the Governor-General's building. He steps out onto the same balcony where General Massu had announced the rebellion just a few weeks prior. He stands there for a moment, an immense, imposing figure, letting the roar of the crowd wash over him. They are chanting for him. They are chanting for the army. And above all, they are chanting the 3 magic words they have come to hear him say, Algerie, Française. Then he speaks. And what comes out is one of the most brilliant and most slippery political speeches of the 20th century. He starts by praising them, validating their passion. He salutes the army and its leaders. He's telling them, "I see you. I hear you." And then he delivers the line, the absolute masterpiece of political ambiguity that will echo through French history forever. He looks out at the roaring crowd and declares, "Je vous ai compris. I have understood you." What on God's green earth does that mean? It's a sentence that's a political Rorschach test. It's a perfectly polished mirror. The 500,000 people in that square, high on adrenaline and hope, looked into that mirror and saw exactly what they wanted to see. They heard, "I have understood your demand that Algeria must remain French, and I, Charles de Gaulle, agree with you and will make it so." The cheer that erupts from the crowd is seismic. It is a sound of pure, cathartic relief. Their hero has given them his blessing. But de Gaulle was playing a much, much deeper game. "I have understood" you can also mean, "I have understood the depth of your passion," or "I have understood the complexity of your fears," or even "I have understood your situation, and I will now proceed to deal with it as I and I alone see fit." It confirms nothing. It promises nothing. It is a sentence of profound empathy that carries zero political commitment. He continues. He declares that from this day forward, in all of Algeria, there is only one category of inhabitant, des Français à part entière, fully fledged Frenchmen, with the same rights and the same duties. To the crowd, this sounds great. It sounds like an affirmation of Frenchness. But it's also a radical promise of total equality for the 9 million Muslim Algerians, the very thing the colonial system was built to prevent. He is, in plain sight, planting the seeds of a policy that completely undermines the old order. He finishes his short, powerful speech with a booming, "Vive la France!" The crowd goes insane. They are weeping with joy. Their victory is complete. It's only later, after the euphoria wears off, that a few of the more astute listeners realize the one thing he didn't say. In the entire speech, he never once uttered the phrase they were all waiting for. Algérie Française, personified dialogue ecstatic, pied noir, waving a flag, tears streaming down his face. "Pierre, did you hear it? Did you hear the general? He said he understood us. He understood us. It's finally over. We've won. Long live de Gaulle. Long live French Algeria." Skeptical army general, lighting a cigarette, his expression unreadable. I heard Jean-Luc, "Je vous ai compris," a magnificent phrase. He also said that your mechanic Mustafa now has the exact same rights as you do. Are you prepared for that? Ecstatic pied noir. Details, details. He's with us. The general is with us. It was the most powerful speech I have ever witnessed. Skeptical army general. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of rhetoric. I'm just not entirely sure what he actually promised. It felt like being handed a beautifully wrapped, very expensive gift box. I just have a nagging suspicion that when we open it, it might be completely empty. This was de Gaulle, the magician at the height of his powers. He walked into a city on the brink of civil war, a city that thought it had summoned him to do its bidding, and with about 200 carefully chosen words, he calmed the rebellion and took back control of the situation. He didn't lie to them. He simply constructed a speech so brilliantly ambiguous that it allowed them to lie to themselves. He gave them the emotional validation they craved while giving himself the complete political freedom he needed. He had successfully defused the bomb of Algiers. Now, with the settlers and the army temporarily pacified, he could return to Paris and begin to figure out what he was actually going to do. Having successfully mesmerized the angry mob in Algiers with his political snake-charming act, Charles de Gaulle returned to Paris with the one thing he needed most: breathing room. He had calmed the immediate crisis, stared down his own army, and cemented his authority. Now he had to actually govern, and that meant he needed a real concrete policy for the Algerian mess, something more substantial than a brilliantly vague four-word sentence. De Gaulle was many things, but a fool wasn't one of them. He was a stone-cold realist. He looked at the situation in Algeria, 1 million Europeans sitting on top of 9 million increasingly furious Muslims, and understood that the old colonial model was a dead man walking. The status quo was unsustainable, but he wasn't yet ready to consider the idea of an independent Algeria. That was still a bridge too far. So he settled on a third option. If he couldn't hold Algeria by force and he wouldn't let it go, then maybe he could bribe it into staying. This was the genesis of his first major initiative, the Constantine Plan. In October 1958, de Gaulle flew back to Algeria, this time to the city of Constantine, to unveil his grand vision. And it was grand. This wasn't some minor reform package, it was the most ambitious, eye-wateringly expensive economic and social development plan in the history of colonialism. It was in essence an attempt to buy the loyalty of the Algerian people. The promises de Gaulle laid out were staggering. Over the next 5 years, France would create 400,000 new industrial jobs for Algerians. They would build massive new housing projects. They would implement a huge land reform program, seizing 250,000 hectares of settler-owned land and redistributing it to Muslim farmers. A direct shot across the bow of the wealthy Pied Noir landowners. He promised to bring Muslim wages up to the same level as those in mainland France. Most radically, he pledged a massive investment in education, with the goal of having 2/3 of all Algerian children, including girls, in school within 5 years. He was essentially promising to turn Algeria from a neglected, semi-feudal territory into a modern, educated industrial society, virtually overnight. The strategic calculation behind the Constantine Plan was clear. De Gaulle believed that the Algerian rebellion was fundamentally rooted in poverty, hopelessness, and a lack of dignity. He figured that a young Algerian man with a steady job in a new factory, a decent apartment for his family, and a real future for his children would be far less likely to listen to the FLN's call to revolution. He was trying to kill the rebellion with kindness, or at least with jobs and infrastructure. He was making an offer: stick with France and you will have prosperity. The subtext was equally clear: choose independence and you'll be on your own in the dark. It was a strategy of seduction, an attempt to make the French option so dazzlingly attractive that the nationalist cause would simply wither and die from lack of interest. Personified dialogue, de Gaulle, sitting across a table from a sullen, silent Algeria. He slides a thick, glossy brochure across the table. Algeria, my dear, I know we've had our disagreements. I have perhaps been a neglectful guardian, but that is all in the past. I want to make a new start. Algeria. Arms crossed, doesn't even look at the brochure. After 130 years of taking my land and treating me like a servant, now you want a new start? De Gaulle. Precisely. And to show my sincerity, I come bearing gifts. Open the brochure. Inside you will find shiny new steel plants, hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs, schools for all your children, land reform, equal pay. I'm going to make you the most prosperous, modern, and envied nation in all of Africa. All you have to do is tear up that silly Declaration of Independence and agree to stay part of my magnificent family. Algeria. So, after I started a revolution, burned down your farms, and got the whole world to notice, your solution is to try and buy me off with a construction budget? De Gaulle, I prefer to see it as a very generous investment in our shared future, a golden opportunity. It would be a shame if you were to turn it down. On paper, the Constantine Plan was revolutionary. It was a blueprint for a kind of progressive, post-colonial partnership that was decades ahead of its time. If France had offered this deal in 1948 instead of 1958, the Algerian War might never have happened. But de Gaulle was offering a magnificent state-of-the-art solution to yesterday's problem. The war was no longer just about bread, land, and jobs. 4 years of brutal fighting and sacrifice had transformed it into something else entirely. It was now a war about identity. It was about national pride. It was about having their own flag, their own anthem, their own seat at the United Nations. De Gaulle was offering Algeria a beautiful gilded cage, complete with all the modern amenities. But the FLN had already promised it the sky. And for a people determined to be free, that was an offer no amount of money could beat. So Charles de Gaulle has just unveiled his magnificent Constantine Plan, a glorious vision of a prosperous, modern, and thoroughly French Algeria. He's essentially offered the Algerian people a deal. Give up your revolution, and I will personally make you rich. He then stands back, expecting a period of thoughtful consideration, perhaps even gratitude. What he gets instead is the geopolitical equivalent of a door slammed in his face. The FLN is not just unimpressed, they are insulted. They see the Constantine plan for exactly what it is, a desperate last-ditch attempt to buy them off with shiny new things, a neo-colonial bribe wrapped in the language of progress. Their response is twofold. First, on the ground, they ramp up their military attacks to signal that the war is very much still on. Second, and far more significantly, they make a huge political move designed to completely upend de Gaulle's strategy. Just before de Gaulle's big speech, the FLN formally announces the creation of the GPRA, the Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic. This is a massive deal. They are no longer a front or a movement. They are now, in their own eyes and the eyes of a growing number of countries, a government in exile, with a named president, Ferhat Abbas, a cabinet, and a diplomatic corps. This is a brilliant counterplay. It sends a crystal-clear message to de Gaulle and the world. We are not rebels you can bribe or pardon. We are a state. The only discussion we are willing to have is a government-to-government negotiation about the terms of your withdrawal. This puts de Gaulle in a very tight spot. His economic peace offering is dead on arrival, and he cannot possibly recognize the GPRA, the army, the Pieds Noirs, and the entire right wing of French politics who still think de Gaulle is their champion, would see it as a complete capitulation to terrorism. His hands are tied. So, with his first plan in ashes, he tries a new tactic. If he can't buy them off and he can't negotiate with their leadership, maybe he can split them. Maybe he can appeal directly to the fighters in the field, the guys in the mountains over the heads of their political leaders. On October 23, 1958, de Gaulle holds a press conference and extends a dramatic, seemingly generous olive branch. He offers the paix des braves, the peace of the brave. With his most commanding sonorous voice, he addresses the FLN soldiers directly. He acknowledges their courage. He doesn't call them criminals or terrorists. He calls them braves. He then makes his offer. Any fighter who wishes to stop fighting can simply walk out of the mountains. They can surrender with their weapons. He gives his personal word, the word of Charles de Gaulle, that they will be allowed to return to their families freely, honorably, and without reprisal or humiliation. It was a clever piece of psychological warfare. It was a soldier's offer to other soldiers, an attempt to build a bridge of mutual respect between warriors and isolate the meddling politicians of the GPRA. The offer was simple. Lay down your arms and go home with your honor intact. The catch, of course, was that this was an offer of individual surrender, not a negotiation. It was a path to peace, but a peace on purely French terms. The FLN as a political entity would get nothing. The question of independence was not on the table. The GPRA's response was immediate, unified, and utterly contemptuous. They left de Gaulle on red. Or more accurately, they sent back a formal communiqué basically telling him to get lost. Personified dialogue. De Gaulle, speaking into a radio microphone, his voice echoing with gravitas. Listen to me, you who are fighting in the mountains. You are brave men. I, de Gaulle, recognize your courage. But this fight is fratricidal and hopeless. Cease the fire. I offer you the peace of the brave. Come out. Turn in your arms. Your honor will be safe. You will be free to return to your villages and your families. This is my solemn promise. GPRA. From a radio station in Tunis, a crisp, formal voice reads a typed statement. The Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic has received a communication from the head of the French state. We appreciate his comments on the bravery of our National Liberation Army. However, Mr. de Gaulle seems to be operating under a significant misapprehension. Our soldiers are not lost children waiting for a paternalistic pardon. They are the armed forces of a sovereign state fighting for national liberation. We are not interested in an honorable pass to go home. We are home. We will entertain discussions about a ceasefire only when France is ready to negotiate the terms of its military and political withdrawal with this government. We await your formal diplomatic overture. Good day. The peace of the brave was a complete and utter flop. A handful of fighters turned themselves in, but the vast majority stayed loyal to the FLN command. De Gaulle had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had tried to appeal to the soldiers' sense of military honor, but he failed to grasp that their primary identity was no longer just soldier. It was citizen of a future Algeria. Their fight wasn't a job they could honorably quit. It was a crusade to build a nation. De Gaulle, the general, had tried to speak to other soldiers, but he was completely shut down by the FLN, the government. Two of his grand initiatives, the economic bribe and the offer of surrender, had now failed. Back in Algiers, the generals and the settlers who had put him in power were watching all of this, and they were starting to get a very bad feeling. De Gaulle's first year in power was a whirlwind of activity, but to the hardliners in Algiers who had engineered his return, it was a deeply confusing and increasingly worrying performance. They had summoned what they thought was a lion, a fierce nationalist who would roar Algeria and France from the rooftops. Instead, they got a sphinx, a cryptic and calculating creature who spoke in riddles. The red flags were starting to pile up. First, there was the "I have understood you" speech, all emotion and no substance. Then came the Constantine Plan, with its radical promises of Muslim equality and settler land redistribution, which sounded suspiciously like a plan to undermine the entire colonial power structure. Then, the Peace of the Brave, an offer that dignified the FLN fighters as honorable adversaries instead of just branding them as terrorists. To the generals and the Pieds Noirs, their hero was starting to talk and act in a very strange way. He was not behaving like a man determined to hold on to a territory at all costs. But here's where things get really weird and contradictory. While de Gaulle was making these politically squishy moves, he was also unleashing the full devastating might of the French military. He appointed a new commander-in-chief in Algeria, General Maurice Chalais, a brilliant and energetic Air Force general. Chalais launched a new massive offensive that would become the most successful military campaign of the entire war. The Chalais Plan was a masterpiece of counterinsurgency. Using mobile, helicopter-borne commandos, French forces systematically swept across the country, hunting down and destroying the FLN's internal guerrilla units, the Maquis. It was relentless, methodical, and brutally effective. By the end of 1959, the FLN's army inside Algeria was effectively broken. They had been pushed back to their sanctuaries in Tunisia and Morocco. Their leadership was in disarray, and their ability to operate inside the country was crippled. The French army in Algeria was ecstatic. This was it. This was the victory they had been bleeding for 5 long years. They had finally done it. They had crushed the rebellion on the battlefield. All their sacrifices, including the morally compromising ones during the Battle of Algiers, had paid off. Now surely, with the enemy on their knees, their great leader, de Gaulle, would step forward, plant the French flag firmly in the ground, and declare a victor's peace. The war was won. Case closed. But de Gaulle, sitting in his palace in Paris, was reading from a completely different script. He was a political realist above all else. He looked at the impressive battlefield reports and saw not an end, but an opportunity. He knew that a military victory was meaningless in the long run. They could kill every FLN fighter, but they couldn't kill the idea of Algerian nationalism. They couldn't occupy a hostile population of 9 million people forever. The war was financially bankrupting France and destroying its international reputation. De Gaulle understood that the war had to end, and he saw the army's victory not as a mandate to keep Algeria, but as a position of strength from which he could negotiate an exit without looking like he had been defeated. He was winning the war so he could afford to lose the peace. The generals in Algiers, men who had dedicated their lives to the army and to the glory of the French Empire, began to pick up on this terrifying dissonance. They would send glowing reports of victory to Paris, expecting congratulations. Instead, they would get back cryptic philosophical musings from de Gaulle about the winds of change and the destiny of peoples. They were winning the war, but their president kept talking as if they were losing. The horrifying suspicion began to dawn on them. De Gaulle wasn't their savior. He was their undertaker. He was using their military success as a smokescreen to prepare for the abandonment of French Algeria. Personified dialogue. The French army, bursting into de Gaulle's office, covered in glory, holding up battlefield maps. "My general, it is done. The Chala plan is a staggering success. The FLN Maquis are shattered. We control the territory. We have achieved the total military victory you asked for. Now we can finally secure French Algeria forever. Charles de Gaulle, staring out the window at the gardens, barely glancing at the maps. Your tactical achievements have been exemplary. You have given France the upper hand. This provides a most favorable position from which to contemplate the larger, historical realities. The army. Historical realities, Gauguin, sir. We just won the war. The reality is that we've won. De Gaulle, you have won the military engagement. That is the army's function, and you have done it well. My function, however, is to secure the future and the greatness of France. A great nation cannot remain shackled to an enterprise with no future. Your victory allows us to choose our own destiny. With honor. The army, a cold knot of dread forming in its stomach. Sir, what destiny are we choosing? When you say choose, you don't mean choose to leave, do you? Sir, are you planning on giving it all away after we just won it? This was the beginning of the Great Schism. The army felt they had upheld their end of the bargain. They had fought, they had won, and now they expected their reward. But they were slowly, horribly realizing that their leader had changed the rules of the game without telling them. They thought they were fighting a war for territory. De Gaulle was fighting a war for the soul of France itself, and he had decided that Algeria was a limb that needed to be amputated to save the body. The people who had hailed him as a father figure a year ago now began to see him as a traitor, and their sense of betrayal was about to erupt into open defiance. The dawning suspicion that Charles de Gaulle was not the savior they had prayed for was now curdling into a full-blown panic among the settlers and army hardliners in Algiers. They were watching their hero, their father figure, using language that sounded suspiciously like he was packing their bags for them. The final unforgivable straw came in January 1960. General Massu, the man who won the Battle of Algiers, the ultimate tough guy champion of Algeria and France, gave an interview to a German newspaper where he got a little too honest. He expressed his frustration with de Gaulle's squishy politics and openly wondered if the army had made a huge mistake bringing him to power. For de Gaulle, this was an act of public insubordination he could not tolerate. You don't question the king in public. Massu was immediately recalled to Paris and fired. In Algiers, this news landed like a grenade. De Gaulle had fired their hero. He had gotten rid of the one man they trusted to protect them. This was it, the proof. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was happening right now, in plain sight. They decided it was time for another tantrum, but this time, a much bigger and more dangerous one. On January 24, 1960, urged on by ultra-nationalist agitators, a massive crowd of Pieds Noirs surged into the center of Algiers. But this wasn't just a protest. This was an insurrection. They erected massive barricades, overturning cars, ripping up fences and piling up furniture, creating a fortified camp, a national redoubt, in the heart of the capital. Armed civilian militias patrolled the perimeter. They were daring the French state to come and get them. This was the week of the barricades. This created a moment of profound crisis for the French army. De Gaulle from Paris gave a simple, direct order: clear the barricades, crush the insurrection. But for the soldiers on the ground, especially the elite paratroopers, this order was impossible. For 5 years they had been told that these settlers were the loyal French citizens they were fighting and dying to protect. Now they were being ordered to point their guns at them. When the Paras advanced, they were met not with bullets but with French flags, with women and children singing La Marseillaise, with men screaming at them, "We are fighting for you. Don't betray us too." The situation turned tragic when a unit of gendarmes, a national police force seen as more loyal to the government in Paris, exchanged fire with the insurgents. 22 men, 14 of them gendarmes, were killed. After that bloodshed, the paratroopers flatly refused to attack. They stood down. They began fraternizing with the people on the barricades, sharing cigarettes and coffee, creating a bizarre standoff. The army in Algeria was in a state of passive mutiny, refusing a direct order from their commander-in-chief. The French Republic was, for the second time in 2 years, on the verge of breaking. But this time the man in charge wasn't some weak, vacillating prime minister of the Fourth Republic. It was Charles de Gaulle. And de Gaulle did not blink. He went on national television and radio to address the nation and especially the army. But he didn't appear in a suit. He appeared in his full two-star general's uniform, adorned with all his wartime medals. He was reminding the army of who he was, not just a politician, but their leader, the embodiment of military honor. In a calm, severe, and deeply paternal tone, he laid down the law. He spoke directly to the army. Your duty is to serve France, and I am France. Your mission is to obey my orders. He dismissed the insurgents as misguided liars leading France to ruin. He was clear, firm, and radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. Personified dialogue. Armed settler on a barricade. Brother, paratrooper, soldier of France. Look what the traitor in Paris is doing. Firing Massou, preparing to hand our homes to the terrorists. You must stand with us. We are the real France. We are fighting for your honor. Young paratrooper. Looking deeply conflicted, his rifle lowered. My heart is with you. We have fought for 5 years for this land. For French Algeria. Settler, then join us. Are you a soldier of de Gaulle or a soldier of France? Paratrooper. I don't know anymore. Last night I watched the general on a small television we have in the barracks, in his uniform. He spoke to us. He said our duty was to him. He is our commander. He is de Gaulle. Settler. He is a politician. We are patriots. Paratrooper. He is my general. My orders are to restore order. I am sorry. De Gaulle's speech was a masterstroke. It completely cut the ground out from under the insurrection. For the soldiers wavering on the streets of Algiers, watching the living legend of France on TV telling them to do their duty, the choice became clear. Their loyalty was not to the mob on the barricades. It was to their commander, to the state, to de Gaulle. The army's support for the insurgents evaporated overnight. Suddenly isolated and facing loyal military units, the rebellion collapsed. After 8 days, the leaders surrendered or fled to Spain. De Gaulle had faced down an open rebellion from his own supporters and had won an overwhelming victory. He had asserted his total authority over the army and the state, and now that he had proven he was in charge, he was finally free to drop the ambiguity and reveal what his plan for Algeria truly was. Having successfully stared down a full-blown insurrection and reasserted his godlike authority over the army, Charles de Gaulle now had a completely free hand. The hardliners who had put him in power were now defeated, disorganized, and demoralized. The army had been reminded who was boss. He no longer needed to speak in riddles or hide behind ambiguous phrases. He could finally take off the mask and reveal his true, terrifying endgame for Algeria. So, in a major televised address to the French nation in September 1959, a policy he would forcefully reassert after the barricades crisis proved he had the power to see it through, de Gaulle did the unthinkable. He uttered the word that was absolute poison to the ears of every settler and every army officer in Algiers. He dropped the S-bomb, autodetermination, self-determination. The shockwave was instantaneous. For 5 years, the entire French state had operated on the non-negotiable principle that Algeria was France. Period. De Gaulle, the great nationalist hero, had just announced that this principle was, in fact, negotiable. He laid out a new policy, presenting the Algerian people with a future choice, a vote to be held once the fighting had died down. He gave them 3 options. Option 1, secession, outright independence, a complete divorce from France. De Gaulle presented this as a terrible choice that would lead to unbelievable poverty, political chaos, and bloody, widespread slaughter. But the key thing is, for the first time ever, it was officially on the table. Option 2, Francisation. Complete and total integration. Algeria would become a set of French provinces, identical to those in the mainland, with every single inhabitant having the exact same rights and duties as a citizen in Paris or Lyon. This was the option the most liberal of the settlers claimed to want, but it was a fantasy. Option 3, association. This was the option de Gaulle clearly favored. Algeria would become its own self-governing country, running its own internal affairs but would remain in a special association with France. This meant France would still control its defense, its foreign policy, and its economy, especially the new Saharan oil fields. It was a kind of independence light, a way for France to give up political responsibility while keeping all the good stuff. To the FLN's provisional government, this was a stunning development. They publicly scoffed at the offer, rejecting the idea of association and insisting that the only topic for discussion was total independence. But privately, they knew this was a massive victory. The president of France had, for the first time, admitted that independence was a possible outcome. The wall of French intransigence had finally cracked. To the settlers and the army hardliners, however, this wasn't a crack. It was the end of the world. The speech was the ultimate, most profound betrayal imaginable. The very concept of offering a choice was, to them, a complete surrender. They knew how the math worked. In any one-person, one-vote referendum, the 9 million Muslim Algerians would outvote the 1 million Europeans. Offering a vote on secession was the same as guaranteeing secession. The word self-determination was just a polite diplomatic euphemism for giving our home away to the terrorists. Personified dialogue. Horrified Pied Noir. Staring at his television, his face ashen. Did you hear him? I don't believe it. Self-determination, he said it. He's letting them vote on our future. After all this fighting, all this blood, he's just giving it away. Cynical French official, calmly sipping a coffee. He is merely offering a democratic choice, as is the tradition of our great republic. Francization is one of the options. If you truly believe the majority of the population wishes to remain French, then you have nothing to worry about. Horrified Pied Noir. Don't be an idiot. You know how they'll vote. 9 million of them against 1 million of us. It's a loaded gun pointed at our heads. He's using democracy to destroy us. It's a trick. Cynical French official. The general is a great man. He believes in many things. He believes in the glory of France. He believes in his own destiny. And it would appear, he also believes in arithmetic. The war is no longer about preserving the past. It's about negotiating the least damaging exit possible. I'd advise you to prepare for the future. And there it was. The mask was off. The great betrayal wasn't a paranoid fantasy anymore. It was now the official policy of the French government, announced by the very man the hardliners had thought was their savior. De Gaulle had fundamentally changed the entire objective of the war. The goal was no longer to win and keep Algeria. The goal was now to manage its departure. For the army officers who had fought and bled for 5 years, this was an unbearable dishonor. They had been ordered to win a war. They had won the war on the battlefield, and now the president was preparing to give away the prize. They felt tricked, humiliated, and utterly betrayed. And the most extreme among them were not going to take this lying down. If the politicians in Paris were going to surrender, then maybe it was time to get a new set of politicians. By force. De Gaulle's self-determination speech was the final, unforgivable sin. In the eyes of the true believers of French Algeria, their leader had publicly announced his intention to commit treason. The sense of betrayal within the hardline elements of the army was now absolute. They had been lied to, used, and were about to be dishonored. A secret cabal of the army's most revered and decorated officers decided that if Charles de Gaulle would not save the French Empire, they would save the empire from Charles de Gaulle. This was their last stand. The conspiracy was led by a quartet of retired generals, as de Gaulle would later scathingly call them. These weren't just any old officers. They were living legends of the French army. There was Maurice Charles, the architect of the victorious Chalet Plan. There was Raoul Salan, the single most decorated soldier in the entire military. There was Edmond Jouhaux, an Air Force general and a native Pied Noir. And there was André Zeller, a stern army traditionalist. These men were relics of a bygone era, steeped in the glory of the empire, and they genuinely believed they were acting to save the honor of France. In the early hours of April 22, 1961, they struck. In a lightning-fast operation, the 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment, the most elite and battle-hardened unit in the army, seized control of Algiers. They captured the governor-general, took over the radio station, and arrested all civilian and military authorities loyal to Paris. General Chalet went on the radio and announced that the army had taken control of Algeria to protect it from abandonment. The general's putsch was on. Their plan was simple: replicate the successful coup of 1958. First, secure Algeria. Then, threaten to drop the paratroopers on Paris, forcing de Gaulle to resign and hand power over to them. It was a solid plan, with one tiny flaw. This was 1961, not 1958. And the man in the Élysée Palace was not a shuffling, weak-willed politician. It was Charles de Gaulle, and he was furious. De Gaulle went on television, once again donning his general's uniform. But this was not the paternal, commanding de Gaulle of the weak of the barricades. This was de Gaulle radiating pure, concentrated rage. He spat contempt on the plotters, dismissing them as a quartet of retired generals and partisan, ambitious, and fanatical officers. He declared a state of emergency, invoked the Constitution to give himself absolute power, and most importantly, he forbade, with all his authority, any French person from giving the rebels any assistance whatsoever. Françaises, Français, aidez-moi, he thundered. Frenchmen, Frenchwomen, help me. The speech was a killer blow, but the coup's real undoing came from a much smaller piece of technology: the humble transistor radio. The generals had the elite paratroopers and the Foreign Legion on their side, but the vast majority of the French army in Algeria consisted of conscripts, regular 20-year-old kids from the mainland who were just doing their mandatory service and wanted to go home. They didn't care about Algerie Française. The loyalist government in Paris started blasting de Gaulle's speech and anti-putsch propaganda on every available frequency, and every one of those conscripts had a little pocket radio. While the rebel generals were issuing orders, their soldiers were huddled around their transistors, listening to the legitimate head of state tell them that their bosses were traitors. The whole coup fell apart in a cascade of tragicomic failures. The rebel generals ordered army units to join them, and the units just didn't. Conscripts would lose the keys to trucks, pilots would report sudden mechanical failures on their planes, and entire battalions just stayed in their barracks, refusing to move. The image of the powerful, decorated General Chalet trying to rally support, only to be met with the passive, radio-listening indifference of the common soldier, was a perfect symbol of the whole affair. The generals had the muscle, but de Gaulle had the airwaves. Personified dialogue, General Chalet. Pacing in his new headquarters. Excellent. We have secured Algiers. The first REP has performed magnificently. Now, what is the status of the Air Force? We need the planes ready to threaten Paris. General Juho. About that. We have a small issue. The conscript mechanics report that every single transport plane has developed a sudden, mysterious hydraulic leak, all at the same time. They're very sorry. General Salan. Never mind the planes. What about the 2nd Zouave Regiment? I ordered them to march on Oran. An aide. Sir, their colonel reports that the entire regiment's truck pool has flat tires, and the conscript drivers are all suffering from a sudden debilitating case of apathy. They are listening to pop music on their transistor radios and refusing to find the spare tires. General Chalet stares in disbelief. So you are telling me that our grand putsch, our last stand to save the French Empire, is being defeated by lazy teenagers with radios? After 4 days, the coup had completely collapsed. It was a humiliating, pathetic failure. The rebel units surrendered. The first rep was disbanded in disgrace. Chalet and Zeller gave themselves up, and Salan and Juho slipped into the shadows to continue the fight underground. The general's putsch was over. De Gaulle had faced down the last great challenge from his own military and had crushed them utterly. He had proven, once and for all, that the army served the state, not the other way around. But while the general's rebellion had failed, the most fanatical, most violent believers in French Algeria were not about to give up. The war was entering its ugliest, most desperate phase. The general's putsch had failed. It was a pathetic 4-day farce that ended with the most legendary officers of the French army, either in prison or on the run. For the cause of French Algeria, this should have been the end. The army had been brought to heel. De Gaulle's authority was absolute. Any rational observer would conclude that the game was up. But the people fighting for French Algeria were no longer rational. They were desperate, they were furious, and they felt betrayed by everyone. By de Gaulle, by the French public, and now by the formal military which had failed to protect them. So the most extreme, most fanatical, and most violent elements decided that if the official army wouldn't fight for them, they would create an unofficial one. In the shadows of Algiers and Madrid, a new organization was born from the ashes of the failed putsch. It was called the OAS, Organisation Armée Secrète, the Secret Army Organization. This was the supervillain team-up of the Algerian War. It was a toxic cocktail of three distinct groups. First, you had the fugitive generals Raoul Salan and Edmond Jouhaux, who provided the leadership and the prestigious names. Second, you had the muscle, legions of disillusioned junior officers, battle-hardened paratroopers, and foreign legionnaires from the elite units that de Gaulle had disbanded in disgrace. These were professional soldiers, experts in counterinsurgency and explosives, with a massive chip on their shoulders and nothing left to lose. Third, you had the grassroots network, the most extreme Pied Noir student activists and civilian militias, who provided the local knowledge and the burning nihilistic rage. The OAS had a single, terrifyingly simple objective. They knew they couldn't win. They knew de Gaulle was going to negotiate a peace treaty with the FLN. Their goal was to make that peace impossible. They decided that if they could not have French Algeria, then nobody could. Their strategy was pure chaos. They would unleash a campaign of terror so savage and so bloody that it would shatter any hope of a peaceful transition. They hoped to achieve two things. First, to provoke the FLN and the wider Muslim population into massive, bloody reprisals against the Europeans, which would force the French army to re-engage and scuttle the peace talks. And second, if that failed, to simply destroy everything of value so that the FLN would inherit a smoldering ruin. They plunged Algeria, particularly the cities of Algiers and Oran, into a new nightmare. The OAS became masters of urban terrorism. Their signature was the plastiquage, a bombing with plastic explosives. Every night the cities would be rocked by dozens of explosions, targeting anyone and anything. Government offices, the homes of Gaullist officials, liberal intellectuals, and most frequently, random civilian targets in Muslim neighborhoods. They conducted drive-by shootings and targeted assassinations. They even developed a tactic of launching mortars into crowded marketplaces from the backs of moving trucks. They were fighting a war against the future, and their only weapons were fear and death. Personified dialogue OAS recruiter. In a dark, smoky back room in Algiers, speaking to a young, disgraced paratrooper. They took your red beret. They called your commanders traitors. They disbanded the finest regiment in the army, and for what? So that de Gaulle, sitting in his palace, can hand over this land, the land your friends died for, to the very terrorists we spent 7 years fighting to a standstill. Young paratrooper, it's over. The putsch failed. There is nothing to be done. OAS recruiter. The putsch failed because the generals were still playing by the rules. They still believed in the state. We don't. The state has betrayed us. The army has abandoned us. There are no more rules. There is only this land, and the people who belong to it. De Gaulle wants to sign a treaty. We will create a river of blood so wide that no one will be able to cross it to shake hands. We are all that is left. No more orders from Paris. No more laws. Just us, the secret army. Are you with us? This was the death rattle of a dying world. The OAS was the ultimate expression of a community's refusal to accept reality. And in a final, spectacular act of moral collapse, they adopted the very tactics they had once condemned. For years, the French army's justification for its own brutality was that it was fighting against FLN terrorism, the bombs in cafes, the attacks on civilians. Now, the self-proclaimed defenders of Western Christian civilization were doing the exact same thing, but with a chilling efficiency and on a far greater scale. They had become a mirror image of their enemy. This wasn't a war for honor or country anymore. It was a raw, primal scream of rage. And that scream was about to be heard on the streets of Paris itself. The OAS's campaign of terror had turned Algiers and Oran into war zones. But Charles de Gaulle, safe in his palace in Paris, remained unmoved. The bombs and assassinations were not stopping him. He was pushing ahead with plans for negotiations with the FLN. The leaders of the OAS, brilliant military strategists but catastrophically bad politicians, came to a fateful conclusion. If de Gaulle wouldn't feel the pain from 800 miles away, they would have to bring the pain directly to him. They decided to take the war home. They were going to unleash a wave of terror on mainland France, the metropole itself. Their strategy was to make the French public, who were increasingly tired of the war and supportive of de Gaulle's peace efforts, feel the same fear and chaos that the Pieds Noirs were living with every day. They believed that if ordinary French citizens started seeing bombs go off in their own cafes and on their own streets, they would panic and demand that the government stop the peace process and recommit to keeping Algeria French. So the OAS activated its sleeper cells across France and began its Mission France. Suddenly, the violence of Algiers was on the streets of Paris. The nightly plasticouage bombings, once a distant report from across the Mediterranean, were now a terrifying reality in the French capital. The OAS bombed the offices of newspapers that supported de Gaulle, blew up the apartments of liberal politicians, and targeted cafes known to be frequented by left-wing intellectuals. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the most vocal critics of the war, had his apartment bombed twice. It was a campaign designed to shatter the peace of the mainland and prove that nowhere was safe. The ultimate target, of course, was de Gaulle himself. The OAS made numerous attempts to assassinate him, viewing him as the singular traitor responsible for their ruin. The most famous of these came in August 1962, in the Parisian suburb of Petit-Clamart. As de Gaulle and his wife were being driven to the airport, a team of OAS commandos ambushed their car, opening fire with a barrage of machine gun bullets. They fired over 150 shots. 14 bullets struck the presidential Citroën DS. 2 of the car's tires were blown out. The rear window was shattered, passing inches from de Gaulle's head. And yet, incredibly, no one was hurt. The car's revolutionary suspension system allowed the driver to maintain control and speed away on its rims. De Gaulle, famously unflappable, brushed the glass off his coat and remarked, "On the whole, they are very bad shots." The incident only added to his mystique as a man of destiny, literally too cool to be assassinated. Faced with this internal terrorist threat, de Gaulle's government responded with its own brand of ruthless, shadowy warfare. The official police and intelligence services were sometimes too slow, or even secretly sympathetic to the OAS. So the government unofficially sanctioned the creation of parallel counter-terror squads, thuggish groups of loyalists, and hired muscle known as the Barbouzis, the bearded ones or bogeymen. These groups operated outside the law, using the OAS's own tactics of kidnappings, beatings, and summary executions against them. A dirty secret war was now being fought in the alleys and suburbs of France, a war of assassins versus assassins. Personified dialogue, OAS, planting a bomb outside a Parisian bistro, winking at the French public. Surprise! We noticed you were trying to enjoy a quiet life while your country was being given away, so we brought the war to you. A little taste of Algiers right here on the Seine. Are you scared yet? Ready to beg de Gaulle to stop his treacherous peace talks? French public, diving for cover as the bomb explodes. Sacre bleu, are you people insane? We just want to have our aperitifs in peace. This is madness, de Gaulle. Hey de Gaulle, whatever you're doing, do it faster. Sign the papers, end the war. Give them whatever they want. Just make these lunatics stop blowing up our neighborhoods. OAS, standing amidst the rubble, looking confused. Wait, that is not the reaction we were aiming for. And this was the OAS's fatal, spectacular miscalculation. They thought that by terrorizing the French people, they could create a popular backlash against the peace process. What they actually did was the exact opposite. The bombings and assassination attempts horrified the French public. It didn't make them want to hold on to Algeria. It made them desperate to cut the whole cancerous limb off as quickly as possible. The OAS's violence didn't stop the peace process, it turbocharged it. It solidified public support behind de Gaulle and his policy of ending the war at any cost. While the OAS was busy trying to kill him, de Gaulle was ignoring the noise, weathering the storm, and quietly sending his diplomats to a secret location to finally, once and for all, negotiate the terms of the divorce. While the OAS was busy trying to start a civil war on the streets of Paris and Algiers, a very different kind of drama was unfolding in the background. Away from the bombs and the assassins, in the ridiculously tranquil and picturesque setting of a spa town on the shores of Lake Geneva, the end of the war was being quietly, painstakingly negotiated. This was the ultimate split-screen moment. On one side of the screen you have nihilistic terror and chaos. On the other, you have diplomats in sharp suits arguing about treaty clauses over bottled water. The location was Evian-les-Bains, a place famous for its water and its casinos. It was here that Charles de Gaulle's representatives sat down across a table from the representatives of the FLN's provisional government, the GPRA. The security was so tight that the Algerian delegation was actually housed in Switzerland, and they were flown in by helicopter every day to the French side of the lake for the talks. While their respective nations were still technically trying to kill each other, these men were engaged in the delicate, frustrating art of crafting a divorce settlement. The two sides came to the table with completely different objectives. The French delegation, led by Louis Joux, had been given their marching orders by de Gaulle. Their goal was no longer to keep Algeria. It was to manage the exit. They were there to secure the best possible terms for France, protect the 1 million European settlers, guarantee French access to Saharan oil and gas, hang on to a few key military bases, and hopefully create some kind of special relationship that would keep an independent Algeria and France as sphere of influence. They were trying to lose gracefully while pocketing as much of the silverware as they could on the way out the door. The Algerian delegation, led by the tough revolutionary Krim Belkacem, had a much simpler agenda. They had been fighting for over 7 years. Thousands of their people had died. They weren't there to compromise on the fundamentals. Their position was a rock. They wanted 3 things and they were non-negotiable. 1. Total, complete, and indivisible sovereignty and independence. No association, no independence lead. 2. The territorial integrity of Algeria, which absolutely had to include the massive oil-rich Sahara Desert. 3. The recognition of the FLN as the one and only legitimate representative of the Algerian people. The negotiations were a long, grinding, soul-crushing slog that lasted for the better part of a year. Talks would start, hit a roadblock, collapse in acrimony, and then be secretly restarted through back channels. The biggest sticking point by far was the Sahara. France had only recently discovered massive oil and gas reserves there, and they were desperate to hang on to them. They tried everything. They proposed detaching the Sahara from the rest of Algeria, making it a separate French territory. The FLN's answer was always the same: no. The Sahara is Algeria, is. The second major issue was the fate of the Pieds Noirs. France wanted special guarantees, dual citizenship, a protected status. The FLN's position was cold and simple. When Algeria is independent, they will have a choice. They can become Algerian citizens and be treated like all other Algerians, or they can remain French citizens and be treated like foreigners. Personified dialogue. French diplomat, spreading a large map on the polished table. Gentlemen, a proposal. We are prepared to recognize Algerian sovereignty over the northern territories. However, the Sahara, as you can see, is a distinct geographical entity. For economic and security reasons, it will remain under French authority. Algerian diplomat. Doesn't even glance at the map, takes a slow sip of water. No. French diplomat. I beg your pardon, just no. Algerian diplomat. The Sahara is the heart of our country. Your proposal is like asking a man to sell you his legs. The territorial integrity of our nation, from the sea to the desert, is not a point of discussion. It is a precondition for any further discussion. Next item. French diplomat. Sweating slightly, shuffles his papers. Very well. The question of the European minority. We insist on constitutional guarantees for their rights, their property, and their political representation. Algerian diplomat. They will be offered Algerian citizenship. If they accept, they will have the rights of all citizens. If they refuse, they will have the rights of all foreigners. It is very simple. We do not do special categories. This was the new reality. For the first time in 132 years, France was no longer in a position to dictate terms to the Algerians. They were equals at the negotiating table, and the Algerian delegation, hardened by years of war, played their hand with masterful patience. They knew that de Gaulle needed this deal even more than they did. The OAS was tearing France apart. The world was watching. All the FLN had to do was sit there, absorb the French proposals, and calmly say no to anything that compromised their core demands. Eventually, de Gaulle, desperate to end the chaos, gave his negotiators the green light. He conceded on the Sahara. Algeria would be whole. With that massive obstacle removed, the path was finally clear. A deal was within reach. After nearly a year of grinding negotiations, backroom deals, and marathon sessions fueled by coffee and mutual exhaustion, the moment finally came. On March 18, 1962, in that surreal bubble of tranquility at Évian-les-Bains, the French and Algerian delegations signed the papers. The Évian Accords were a reality. After 132 years of French rule and 7.5 years of the most brutal war in its modern history, the divorce was official. The Accords were a complex, carefully worded document, a masterclass in finding just enough common ground to stop the killing. It was the world's messiest breakup treaty. Here are the highlights of the settlement. First, a ceasefire was to take effect the very next day, March 19th, across all of Algeria. For the first time in nearly 8 years, the official war between the French army and the FLN was over. Second, a referendum on independence would be held in Algeria within 6 months. This was a formality. Everyone knew the outcome was a foregone conclusion. But it was the democratic stamp of approval de Gaulle needed. France officially pledged to recognize the result. Third, the FLN won its biggest prizes. The Accords recognized Algeria's total sovereignty and its territorial integrity, specifically including the Sahara and its vast oil and gas wealth. The GPRA was recognized as the legitimate transitional authority until the vote. Fourth, the thorny question of the 1 million pieds noirs. The Accords gave them a 3-year grace period. They could either choose to become full Algerian citizens or remain French citizens, in which case they would be treated as resident foreigners. The treaty included a whole chapter full of lofty guarantees about protecting their property, their culture, and their safety. And fifth, France got to keep some of the furniture. In exchange for everything else, the FLN agreed to let France lease its massive naval base at Mers el-Kébir for 15 years, continue its nuclear testing program in the desert for 5 years, and granted French companies preferential treatment in the oil industry. It was the alimony payment for 132 years of occupation. The reaction to the news was a global sigh of relief. In mainland France, the public was overwhelmingly ecstatic. In a referendum a month later, over 90% of French voters approved the deal. They were sick of the war, sick of the terrorism, sick of the endless political crises. They just wanted it to be over. For the FLN, it was a moment of supreme historic triumph. They had started as a few hundred men with hunting rifles and had fought one of the world's great military powers to a standstill, achieving their single, unwavering goal: a free and sovereign Algeria. But in Algiers, among the Pieds Noirs and the OAS, the news of the Évian Accords was received not with relief, but with a howl of pure, unadulterated rage. This was it, the black and white proof of the great betrayal, the official surrender document. De Gaulle had signed their death warrant. Personified dialogue. A lawyerly mediator, adjusting his spectacles, reading from a document. All right, let's just finalize the terms. France, you agree to a full and immediate ceasefire, will recognize Algeria's complete sovereignty following the referendum, and will vacate the premises. France sighs heavily, signs the document. Fine. But I get to keep my naval base in the garage for 15 years, and my oil companies get first dibs on everything. Algeria signs the document with a sharp, decisive stroke. Agreed. Now about your house guest, the one who's been living here for a century and a half and refuses to leave. Mediator. Ah yes, the Pieds Noirs. The agreement states they have 3 years to choose their citizenship. Their rights and property are explicitly guaranteed herein. France. looks at Algeria with a flicker of concern. You will honor those guarantees, won't you? You will protect them? Algeria gives France a long, cold, unreadable stare. They are welcome to stay as our citizens, with all the rights of citizens. After the last 8 years of war, you'll forgive us if our definition of guaranteed security is a little different from yours. The Evian Accords were a pragmatic and necessary document, but they were built on a foundation of fantasy. It spoke of a future of peaceful cooperation and guaranteed minority rights. But it was signed by two exhausted enemies in a room, while a third party, the OAS, was outside, screaming and lighting fires. The treaty was designed to end the war between France and the FLN, but it was about to trigger a new, even more vicious war. The OAS's war against the peace itself. They saw the ceasefire not as an end, but as a starting pistol for their final apocalyptic campaign of destruction. The signing of the Evian Accords was supposed to bring peace. A ceasefire was called. The war on paper was over, but the OAS didn't read the memo, or more accurately, they read it, shredded it, set it on fire, and then used the ashes to build another bomb. For them, the peace treaty was not an end. It was a declaration of war on the peace itself. Raoul Salan, their clandestine leader, broadcast a message declaring that the OAS would stop at nothing to prevent the crime of abandoning Algeria. What followed was not a battle, but an apocalypse. It was the most violent and bloody period in the cities of the entire 8-year conflict. The OAS unleashed a campaign of pure nihilistic destruction. Their strategy was twofold, and both prongs were soaked in blood. The first was provocation. They began a systematic campaign of murdering Muslim civilians in the most horrific ways imaginable, hoping to trigger a massive, uncontrollable wave of revenge attacks. They wanted the Muslim population to rise up and start slaughtering Europeans, which would give the French army a pretext to intervene, shatter the ceasefire, and tear up the Evian Accords. They were trying to start a race war to save themselves. The second strategy, if the first one failed, was scorched earth, la politique de la terre brûlée. Their reasoning was simple and monstrous. If we have to leave, we will leave nothing behind but a smoking crater. They were determined to destroy the country on their way out, to ensure the newly independent Algeria would be a crippled, ungovernable wreck. The cities of Algiers and Oran descended into a state of anarchic madness. In the 2 months between the ceasefire and the final independence referendum, the OAS killed more people in those two cities than had been killed there in the previous 7 years of war. The daily body count regularly topped 100. They set off an average of 120 bombs a day. They murdered mailmen, milkmen, and grocers just to disrupt daily life. They began a campaign of systematically assassinating Algerian professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects, teachers, engineers, anyone with the skills to help build a new nation. In a final act of cultural nihilism, they set fire to the library at the University of Algiers, burning hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable books and manuscripts. They were literally trying to erase the country's past and future at the same time. And here, in this moment of supreme provocation, the FLN leadership played its final war-winning hand. They did almost nothing. They knew exactly what the OAS was trying to do. With victory so tantalizingly close, the GPRA issued strict orders to its fighters and to the Muslim population: do not retaliate. Do not fall into the trap. It was a moment of almost superhuman political discipline. They understood that all they had to do was weather this final, insane storm. There were, inevitably, localized revenge killings and clashes, but the massive, widespread pogrom the OAS was desperately trying to engineer never happened. The FLN, the terrorists, were now the ones showing restraint, while the defenders of Western civilization were the ones firing mortars into crowded marketplaces. Personified dialogue, fanatical OAS commander, shouting into a stolen army radio. We see you, loyalist curs, hiding in your barracks while your government gives our country away. We are the last patriots. We are burning the fields so the traitors have nothing to harvest. Weary French army captain. You're not burning fields, you lunatic. You just blew up a school for children. You're not soldiers anymore. You're just vandals. OS commander. We are the cleansing fire. We are making this land uninhabitable for them. If we must go, we will salt the earth behind us. There will be nothing left. French Army Captain. There is already nothing left for you here. This is not war. This is not honor. This is the world's most pathetic and bloody going-away party. This was the war's ugliest and most pathetic chapter. It was the death agony of French Algeria, a final violent spasm of a community that saw its world ending and decided to take everyone else with it. The OAS's Scorched Earth campaign was not a military strategy. It was a temper tantrum with a body count. They were not fighting for a cause anymore. They were just lashing out at history itself. Their actions did nothing to stop the inevitable march towards independence. All they did was poison the well of any possible future coexistence and ensure that the final days of the French presence in Algeria would be remembered not with nostalgia or respect, but with the stench of smoke and the memory of senseless murder. The war was over. The ceasefire was holding, more or less. An independent Algeria was now just a matter of a final, ceremonial vote. But the OAS had spent the last 3 months pumping the country full of pure, unadulterated hatred. They had murdered and bombed and terrorized with the express goal of provoking a final, bloody cataclysm, and on July 5, 1962, the official day of Algerian independence celebrations in the hyper-tense, heavily European city of Oran, their wish came true. Oran was a tinderbox. It had been an OAS stronghold, and the animosity between the European and Muslim communities was at an absolute breaking point. On July 5th, the newly victorious Algerian National Liberation Army, the ALN, paraded through the city. The Muslim population was celebrating in the streets, a joyous, chaotic scene. The remaining Europeans were huddled in their homes, terrified. The French army, which a week ago had been the supreme authority, was now under strict orders from Paris to stay in their barracks. Algeria was officially a sovereign country, and de Gaulle had ordered that the French military was not to intervene in its internal affairs. No one was truly in charge. And then, a shot rang out. To this day, nobody knows who fired it. Was it a final, spiteful OAS sniper, hoping to start the very bloodbath they'd been working towards? Was it a jumpy, undisciplined ALN soldier? Was it an accident? It doesn't matter. That single shot was the spark that ignited the entire city. The pent-up rage of 8 years of brutal war, the fresh trauma of the OAS's Scorched Earth campaign, and the sheer chaotic energy of the day exploded into a wave of horrific violence. Armed mobs of Algerian men, a mix of undisciplined ALN soldiers and enraged civilians, poured into the European districts of the city. What followed was not a battle, but a pogrom. They began hunting Europeans. They dragged people from their cars, pulled them out of their homes, and lynched them in the streets. For several terrifying hours, Oran was a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of European civilians were murdered. Hundreds more were kidnapped, herded onto trucks and driven away, never to be seen again. The most shocking and controversial part of this tragedy was what was happening just a few blocks away. The French army, fully armed and equipped, sat in its barracks and did nothing. The officers on the ground were getting frantic reports. They could hear the machine gun fire. They could see the smoke. They were pleading with their high command for permission to intervene, to save the lives of the French citizens being murdered just outside their gates. The order from the top, from de Gaulle's government in Paris, was cold, clear, and absolute. Do not move. This is no longer our problem. It was a moment of stunning, brutal, realpolitik. For 132 years, the entire justification for the French presence in Algeria was the protection of its European population. In their final, most desperate hour of need, the French state deliberately turned its back. Personified dialogue. French captain in Oran, shouting into a field radio, the sound of gunfire in the background. High command, this is Oran. The situation is critical. Mobs are attacking the European quarter. They are killing civilians. I have 2 companies of legionnaires ready to deploy. I request immediate permission to intervene and restore order. Voice from High Command. Negative, Captain. Your orders stand. You are to remain at your post and confine all personnel to the barracks. French Captain. Sir, With all due respect, they are slaughtering French men and women in the streets. We can stop this in 20 minutes. My men are listening to people being murdered. This is a betrayal. Voice from High Command. Captain, as of July 3rd, Algeria is a sovereign nation. The maintenance of public order is the responsibility of the new Algerian state. France's mission in Algeria is over. Do you copy? Over. The Oran massacre was the horrifying, bloody full stop at the end of the long, terrible sentence of French Algeria. The violence eventually burned itself out as the official ALN command managed to regain control of their troops and the city. But the damage was done. The OAS had gotten the explosion of violence they wanted, but it didn't stop independence. It just signed the death warrant for any hope of a continued European presence in the country. For the hundreds of thousands of Pieds Noirs who had been hesitating, wondering if they could maybe stick it out in a new Algeria, the news from Oran was the final, terrifying signal. The choice was no longer between staying and leaving. It was between leaving and dying. The great exodus was about to begin. Awaiting continuity. In the end, after all the bombs, the barricades, the coups, and the terror, French Algeria ended with the quiet scratch of millions of pencils on paper. On July 1, 1962, the referendum on self-determination was held. The question was long and full of legal jargon, but it basically boiled down to, do you want to be an independent country? With the OAS finally broken and the settlers either silent or packing, the result was a foregone conclusion. The turnout was massive. The vote was 5,175,181 in favor and only 16,534 against. That's a yes vote of 99.72%. It was less an election and more a declaration. On July 3rd, Charles de Gaulle formally recognized the result. On July 5th, symbolically 132 years to the day after the French first invaded, Algeria officially declared its independence. The war was over. A new nation was born, and for the 1 million Europeans living there, the world had just ended. Their final, desperate, violent campaign to stop the inevitable had failed. The French army that they thought would protect them was now under orders to facilitate the handover, and the Oran massacre had proven, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the flowery promises of minority protection in the Evian Accords were worth less than the paper they were written on. The choice was no longer complicated. It was boiled down to a single stark, terrifying slogan that spread like wildfire through the community. La valise ou le cercueil, the suitcase or the coffin. What followed was one of the largest and most chaotic population movements of the 20th century. This was not an orderly emigration. It was a panicked, desperate flight. In the summer of 1962, the ports and airports of Algiers and Oran became scenes of pure human misery. Nearly 1 million people, all trying to get out at the same time. They had to abandon homes that their families had lived in for generations, sell businesses for pennies on the dollar, and leave behind everything they couldn't cram into a single suitcase. They were people whose entire identity was French Algerian, a country that in the space of a week had ceased to exist. Their arrival in France was another kind of trauma. The government in Paris, despite having years to plan for this eventuality, was completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale and speed of the exodus. There were not enough houses, not enough jobs, not enough anything. The refugees were housed in squalid temporary camps, often in the cold, damp north of France, a miserable shock for people who had only ever known the Mediterranean sun. The mainland French, for their part, were often not welcoming. They saw the Pieds Noirs not as long-lost brothers, but as noisy, uncouth, and embarrassing reminders of a dirty war they desperately wanted to forget. The refugees from the lost paradise of French Algeria had become exiles in their own motherland. And in this final, chaotic scramble for the exits, the French state committed its last and most shameful act of betrayal. The Harkis, the tens of thousands of Algerian Muslims who had served as auxiliaries in the French army, were abandoned. The Evian Accords had vague protections for them, but de Gaulle's government, wanting a clean break, gave explicit orders to disarm them and prevent their mass evacuation to France. They were branded as the ultimate traitors by the new Algerian state. While a few thousand were saved by French officers who defied orders and smuggled them out, the vast majority were left behind to face horrific reprisals. Tens of thousands were tortured and massacred in the months following independence. a final bloody stain on the honor of the French army. Personified dialogue. A pied noir, standing on the deck of a packed ferry watching the coast of Algiers disappear. He clutches a single suitcase. 4 generations. My great-grandfather planted the first vines on our farm. We were told we were the pioneers, the builders. We were told this was France. 100 years of promises. And it ends like this. A refugee, France, standing awkwardly on the docks at Marseille holding a clipboard and looking stressed as thousands disembark. Ah, yes. Welcome. Home. We have some temporary shelters arranged. A gymnasium, I believe. We weren't quite expecting so many of you all at once. Terribly sorry about the confusion. Pied noir. Home? You call this home? You abandoned us. You left us to be massacred. And the Harkeys, you just left them to die. France. A difficult situation, a political necessity. The page had to be turned. Now, if you'll just join the queue for your refugee processing, we have some soup. And so, the 132-year-long story of French Algeria ended. It died in the chaos of the ports, in the bitterness of exile, and in the killing fields where the Harkeys paid the ultimate price for their loyalty. A new nation, Algeria, was born, free at last, but deeply scarred by one of the most brutal wars of decolonization in history. And another imaginary nation, the French Algeria that had existed in the hearts of 1 million settlers, was now gone forever, a ghost that would haunt French politics for generations to come. The end of a war is never really the end. It's just the beginning of a long, messy, and often painful aftermath. For both Algeria and France, the scars of their 8-year-long bloody divorce would shape their destinies for decades to come. In Algeria, the joyous celebrations of independence quickly gave way to a harsh hangover. The FLN, so brilliantly unified in its fight against the French, immediately fractured now that its common enemy was gone. The leaders who had spent the war in exile, like Ahmed Ben Bella, backed by the powerful border army of Colonel Houari Boumediene, turned on the internal commanders who had done the actual fighting. A brief but bloody power struggle erupted, a civil war in miniature. Ben Bella would emerge as the first president, only to be overthrown in a military coup by his own army chief, Boumediene, a few years later. The dream of a democratic socialist republic gave way to the reality of an authoritarian, single-party state run by the military, a dynamic that would define Algerian politics for the rest of the century. The country was free, but it was also broke. The OAS's Scorched Earth campaign, combined with the sudden flight of nearly all of its European managers, doctors, engineers, and skilled technicians, had left the economy in shambles. Algeria was a sovereign nation, but it was born into a world of pain, propped up only by its newfound oil and gas wealth. Meanwhile, back in France, the nation reacted to the trauma of the war with a profound and deliberate act of collective amnesia. The whole affair was so divisive, so morally compromising, so humiliating, that the country decided the best thing to do was to just not talk about it. For decades, the Algerian War wasn't even officially called a war in France. It was referred to with the bland, bureaucratic euphemism, les événements d'Algérie, the events in Algeria. School textbooks glossed over it. The government suppressed any serious discussion of the army's use of torture. It was a national trauma that France tried to bury, but ghosts don't stay buried. The arrival of 1 million bitter and resentful pieds noirs and the surviving Harkeys created a powerful new political force, fueling the rise of the French far right for generations. The war left France with a permanent Algerian syndrome, a deep-seated wound that continues to fester in contemporary debates about immigration, Islam, and French national identity. In the end, de Gaulle got what he secretly wanted all along. By cutting off the dead weight of the empire, he forced France to stop dreaming of its colonial past and reinvent itself as a modern, European, nuclear-armed power. He amputated the limb to save the body. But phantom limb pain is a very real thing. Personified dialogue France. Years later, awkwardly bumping into Algeria at an international summit. Ah, Algeria. Fancy seeing you here. You're looking prosperous. The oil business is treating you well, I see. Listen, about that whole unpleasantness back in the 50s and 60s. A messy time for everyone. Water under the bridge, eh? Perhaps we can focus on our shared future. Lucrative trade deals, cultural exchanges, that sort of thing. Algeria stares at France with old, tired eyes. Water under the bridge? You occupied my home for 132 years, tried to violently evict me from my own kitchen, and then burned the library on your way out. You left 1 million of your relatives screaming on my doorstep and abandoned your most loyal friends to be murdered. But sure, let's talk about a natural gas contract. France. Splendid. I always knew you were a pragmatist. Algeria. I am. But don't ever mistake pragmatism for forgiveness. The scars are part of the foundation now. And that's how the most toxic relationship in modern colonial history finally staggered to a close. It was a war with no clean victories and no unblemished heroes. Algeria won its flag and its freedom, but traded one master for another and inherited a legacy of violence. France lost its empire and its innocence, and in doing so, was finally forced to confront the realities of the modern world. The Forever War subscription was well and truly canceled, but the emotional baggage came with a lifetime guarantee, a painful, shared history that neither nation can ever truly escape. And so, Algeria finally told France that their subscription to the Forever War had been canceled, effective immediately. Honestly, you probably shouldn't use this podcast as a study guide for your history final, unless your teacher has a really, really weird sense of humor and a low bar for accuracy. But you have to admit, it was way more fun than a textbook. This whole story is a masterclass in how pride, denial, and a complete refusal to read the room can turn a political problem into a decade-long catastrophe. The scars from this conflict still run deep in both France and Algeria, proving that the messiest breakups are the ones where both parties are convinced they're the victim. So, what other historical train wrecks should we simplify next? Let us know in the comments below. We're always looking for another moment when the world's leaders collectively lost their minds, and that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.